Passion. There is a moment, brief, brutal, and completely humiliating, when all the money in the world means absolutely nothing. Damian Cross, a man who built a $4 billion empire from a single idea, stood inside his climate-controlled garage at 5:53 in the morning and turned the key on his $4 million hypercar. Nothing happened, no ignition, no roar, no hum of electronics waking up. Just silence, flat, indifferent, and total. The machine he had spent 18 months commissioning sat there like a beautiful corpse, and not one person on Earth could explain why. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about who really owns an idea. The garage was the size of a small aircraft hangar. That wasn't an exaggeration. Damian Cross had actually converted a section of a decommissioned regional airfield on the outer edge of his property in Scottsdale, Arizona, mostly because the ceiling height in his previous garage had made him feel cramped when he stood next to the taller hypercars. The floor was poured epoxy over polished concrete, sealed to a mirror finish in a shade of charcoal that cost more per square foot than most people's kitchen renovations. The lighting rigs overhead were museum grade, the kind used to illuminate sculpture without shadow, and they came on automatically when the motion sensors detected movement, which meant that every time Damian Cross walked in, the room lit up around him like a theater before the curtain. He had never found that theatrical. He had always found it appropriate. The Vector X9 sat in the center bay. There were 11 other cars in the room, a row of them along the left wall, another along the right, each parked in its own designated slot with its own floor lighting and its own polished placard mounted at eye level on the concrete pillar behind it. The cars ranged from a 1966 Shelby Cobra that Damian had acquired at auction 8 years ago to a current generation formula-derived track car that he took out exactly twice a year. Every car in that room had a story, a price, and a purpose. But none of them had cost what the Vector had cost. None of them had taken what the Vector had taken to acquire. The Vector X9 was not a production car. It was not even a limited edition. It was a commission, one of 2 ever built, the other belonging to a petroleum oligarch in the Gulf, who had reportedly never driven his, and the process of acquiring it had taken Damian Cross nearly 3 years, from the first conversation with Vector's founder to the final delivery, which arrived on a flatbed transporter with 4 armed escorts and a team of 3 technicians who spent 6 hours in this very garage running diagnostics before they would hand over the keys. The car weighed just under 1,000 kilograms. It produced just over 1,200 horsepower through an electric hybrid drivetrain that Vector had spent 4 years developing and still refused to publish the complete specifications for. It had a body sculpted from carbon fiber and titanium that had been tested in a wind tunnel for 700 hours. It could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 2 seconds on a closed track. It cost $4,120,000. And on the morning of Tuesday, October 14th, at 5:53 a.m., it refused to start. What? Damian had come in early because he couldn't sleep. That happened sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, when the pressure of something was sitting too heavy on him to let his body rest. There was a board meeting in 3 days, and the board meeting was going to be difficult because one of the major institutional investors had been asking questions about the licensing division that Damian wasn't entirely comfortable answering in public. He wasn't worried, not exactly, but there was a specific kind of alertness that came with situations like that, a low-level electricity in his body that made sleep feel thin and unsatisfying. So he'd gotten up at 5:30, pulled on a pair of jeans and an old company sweatshirt that he would never have been caught dead in at the office, and walked through the house in the dark to the side entrance that connected to the garage. Walking through the cars in the morning quiet was something he did occasionally when the electricity got too strong. He didn't always drive. Sometimes he just walked and touched things and let the smell of clean machinery and expensive upholstery settle him down. The Vector was in the center bay because that's where it always was. He hadn't driven it in about 3 weeks. He hadn't had time. But the maintenance crew came in every Tuesday to run it through its start cycle, check fluid levels, and update any firmware the onboard system flagged. They'd been here yesterday. Everything should have been in order. He opened the driver's door, folded himself into the seat, and pressed the start button. Nothing. He waited 3 seconds, then pressed it again. Nothing. Not a sound. Not a flicker on the dashboard. The car sat completely dark, completely inert, as though it had been disconnected from its own existence. Damien Cross sat in the dead car for a moment and felt something strange move through him. It wasn't quite anger. It was closer to disbelief, the kind that feels almost insulting, where the world is doing something that seems specifically designed to mock you. He got out, walked to the wall panel, and called his facilities manager. Well, by 7 a.m., the maintenance crew was back. By 9 a.m., they had run every standard diagnostic they had and come up with nothing. By noon, Damien had made 3 calls: to Vector's technical support line in Stuttgart, to the independent exotic car specialist his maintenance crew used for complex electronic issues, and to a former Formula Motorsport engineer named Harlan Becks, who Damien had known for 6 years and who charged $800 an hour and was considered by most people in the industry to be genuinely brilliant. All 3 arrived by the following morning. None of them could figure out what was wrong. The car had power. The battery systems were reading at full capacity. The hybrid drive component showed no fault codes. The onboard computer was running. They could connect to it, pull data from it, run queries. But when they commanded it to initiate the startup sequence, nothing happened. The command went in. The system acknowledged it. And then the car did nothing. "It's like it hears you and just decides not to," said Harlan Becks, sitting on a wheeled stool in front of his laptop with his reading glasses pushed up into his gray hair and a look on his face that Damien had never seen there before. Harlan Becks was not a man who looked uncertain. He looked uncertain now. "I don't pay $4 million for a car that decides not to," Damien said. "I understand that. So fix it." "I'm working on it." He didn't fix it. After 2 more days, Harlan Becks packed his equipment into aluminum cases, handed Damien a bill for $12,000, and told him that in his professional opinion, the fault was somewhere inside the vehicle's proprietary control architecture, meaning the software and hardware systems that Vector had built specifically for the X9 and had not published any documentation for. He could not diagnose what he couldn't see inside, and Vector was not going to show him inside. Day 3 brought a team from Vector itself. 2 engineers flew in from Stuttgart on what was apparently a fairly urgent diplomatic mission, because Damien Cross was not the kind of client you told to be patient. They were polite, thorough, and visibly uncomfortable. Not because they were afraid of Damien, exactly, but because the car was doing something they had apparently not seen before and didn't have an explanation for, which is a specific kind of discomfort for engineers who have spent years building something they believe they understand completely. They spent 2 full days in the garage. They replaced the primary ECU. They replaced the secondary management module. They ran a complete firmware reinstallation from a clean image on a Vector proprietary drive that they had brought from Stuttgart in a case with a combination lock. After the firmware reinstallation, they powered the car up, waited for the system to initialize, and pressed the start button. Nothing. One of the Vector engineers, a younger man named Franz, who had the particular look of someone who had not slept properly in several days, said something in German under his breath that Damien's assistant Reyes, who spoke some German, later translated as, "This is not possible." Damien did not find that comforting. The Vector engineers left on day 5. They took extensive data logs with them and promised to have answers within 72 hours. Damien told them that 72 hours was unacceptable. They went anyway. By day 6, Damien Cross was in a particular state that the people around him recognized as dangerous. It wasn't loud. That was the thing about Damien Cross when he was genuinely angry. He got quieter, not louder. His voice dropped to something almost conversational, stripped of the natural salesmanship and performance that colored his normal register. His sentences got shorter. His requests became statements. He stopped saying please, not out of rudeness exactly, but because in his current state the social lubricant of politeness felt like friction he had no patience for. 6 days. 12 specialists if you counted everyone who had come through the garage. Somewhere north of $140,000 spent on diagnostics, parts replacement, and technician fees. And the car sat exactly as it had on the morning of October 14th, silent, immaculate, and inexplicable. The board meeting had come and gone. Damien's chief of staff had handled most of it. Damien had been present physically, but found his attention drifting, which was unusual enough that two of the board members had commented on it afterward in the corridor, not knowing he could hear them. He was standing in the garage on the evening of day 6, just standing there looking at the Vector, when his phone rang. The caller was a man named Jeffrey Pratt, who ran a high-end automotive concierge service that Damien had used several times over the years for sourcing vehicles and managing transportation logistics for events. Jeffrey was the kind of person who knew everyone in the world of expensive cars, not because he was passionate about them the way enthusiasts were, but because knowing everyone was simply his professional condition. "I heard about your situation," Jeffrey said without preamble. "Then you're better informed than I'd like," Damien said. "I might know someone. I've had someone. I've had 12 someones. Not this one." Jeffrey paused, and Damien recognized the pause. It was the pause of a man who was about to say something he knew sounded ridiculous. "His name is Ethan Mercer. He runs a garage in a town called Deering. Population about 4,000 maybe." Jeffrey: "I know how it sounds. It sounds like you're telling me that after 6 days and 12 specialists, the solution is a small-town mechanic. I'm telling you, I've seen him do things that the specialists couldn't. I'm not telling you how or why, because I don't fully understand it myself. I'm telling you that 3 times in the last 4 years, I've seen cars that no one could figure out, and I mean genuinely no one, and he figured them out. Twice he figured them out in under an hour." Damien looked at the Vector. "Under an hour," he said. "I'm not promising anything. I'm telling you what I've seen." There was a silence. Outside the garage, the Arizona night was warm and still, and somewhere past the property line a coyote made a brief sound and then stopped. "Send me his number," Damien said. Ethan Mercer did not have a website. This was the first thing Damien's assistant Reyes discovered when she tried to research him the following morning. No website, no social media presence of any professional kind, no listings in any of the databases that Reyes used for vetting contractors and specialists. There was an address for a business called Mercer Automotive in the town of Deering, listed on a general business directory with a phone number and the notation established 2009. There were 3 reviews on a platform that mostly covered restaurants, all of them from local residents, all of them brief and positive in the matter-of-fact way that people in small towns write about services they use without thinking about them much. "Fix my truck. Fair price. Didn't try to charge me for things I didn't need." That kind of thing. Reyes compiled what she could, which wasn't much, and put it on Damien's desk with a note that read, "Minimal digital footprint. Couldn't find credentials or certifications. No obvious specialty in exotics or high-performance vehicles. Recommend caution." Damien read the note, set it down, and called Ethan Mercer's number himself, which was unusual. He generally let Reyes make initial contact on his behalf. But something about the situation made him want to make this call himself, possibly because he wanted to hear the man's voice before deciding whether to invite a stranger into the garage where $4 million of idle machinery was sitting. The phone rang 4 times. Then, "Mercer's." The voice was flat. Not unfriendly, just flat, the way people answer phones when they're in the middle of something physical and the phone is an interruption rather than an event. "I'm looking for Ethan Mercer," Damien said. "You got him." "My name is Damien Cross. I was given your number by Jeffrey Pratt." A brief pause. "Jeffrey. Okay. I have a vehicle problem, a significant one. I've had a number of specialists look at it and nobody's been able to diagnose the fault. Jeffrey suggested you might be able to help." Another pause, slightly longer. "What kind of vehicle?" "A Vector X9. There was a silence that went on long enough that Damien thought for a moment the call had dropped. Then, "You sure about the model?" "I'm certain." "Okay." Another pause. "And what's it doing?" "Nothing. It won't start. Full power, no fault codes. The car just won't initiate the startup sequence. Vector sent their own engineers and couldn't explain it." Ethan Mercer made a sound that might have been the beginning of something, a word or a thought or a reaction he decided not to finish. Then, how long has it been down? 6 days. And you've had how many people look at it? 12, roughly, including 2 Vector factory engineers. There was a pause. I'm not promising anything, Ethan said. That's fine. And I charge my standard rate. I don't do special rates based on the car. What's your standard rate? $95 an hour. Damian Cross said nothing for a moment. $95 an hour was what some of his junior software engineers made. It was less than half of what his cleaning service charged for the main house. That's fine, he said. I can come Thursday. Can you come tomorrow? A pause. What time? Whatever time works for you. 9 in the morning, Ethan said. I'll need the full vehicle history and a copy of whatever diagnostic data the previous technicians pulled. I'll have it ready. All right. A brief pause. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Cross. He hung up. No pleasantries, no acknowledgement of who Damian Cross was or what his name meant in any room in America. Just a time, a request for documents, and a goodbye. Damian set down his phone and stared at it for a moment. Ethan Mercer arrived at 8:57 on Wednesday morning in a truck that was 11 years old. Damian knew this because he was watching from the window of his study when the truck came through the gate, and the make and model were recognizable even from a distance. A full-size pickup in a shade of faded navy that had probably been darker when new, with a toolbox mounted in the bed and a slight pulling motion to the left that suggested either a tire issue or a front-end alignment that hadn't been addressed in a while. The truck had been maintained but not pampered. It was the truck of someone who used their vehicle as a tool rather than a statement. The man who climbed out of it looked like he was in his mid-40s, though Damian would later revise that estimate slightly upward. He was medium height, lean in the way that comes from physical work rather than a gym, with dark hair that had started going gray at the temples and a face that had spent time outdoors. He wore dark work pants, a long-sleeve shirt in a muted color, and boots that had clearly been through several years of serious use. He carried a tool bag, not a case, not a rolling cart, but a bag, worn leather, the kind with multiple outer pockets that had been added and repaired over time until the bag itself had become a kind of accumulated object, part tool carrier and part record of use. Reyes met him at the door and brought him through the house to the garage entrance. Damian was already in the garage when they came in, standing near the Vector with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting longer than he wanted to. Ethan Mercer walked into the garage and stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the room, not at any specific car, just at the room as a whole, the way a person looks at something they want to understand the scale of before they start working in it. Then his eyes settled on the Vector, and he walked toward it in a straight line without looking at anything else. He stopped about 4 feet from the car. He didn't crouch or circle it or touch it. He just looked at it. His face was neutral in a way that was hard to read. Not impressed, not unimpressed, just present. "Mr. Mercer," Damian said. Ethan glanced at him. "Mr. Cross?" He looked back at the car. "Where's the documentation?" Reyes handed him a folder. It was thick, 40-some pages of diagnostic logs, technician notes, parts replacement records, the Vector engineer's report, and the original vehicle delivery checklist from 18 months ago. Ethan took it without looking at her and opened it standing there in front of the car, and for the next 7 minutes he read through it with the focused quiet of someone doing a thing they've done many times. He didn't flip through quickly, he didn't skim. He read. He went back to certain pages, he made no notes. When he was done, he handed the folder back to Reyes. "The panel behind the left rear wheel arch," he said. "Is there access from inside the trunk?" "I don't know," Damian said. Ethan went around to the rear of the car, set his bag down, and opened it. He took out a flashlight, not a phone light, an actual flashlight, compact and clearly powerful, and a small flathead screwdriver. He opened the trunk lid, which required entering a code on a panel, because the car's passive system was apparently one of the few electronic functions still operating, and leaned in. He was in the trunk for maybe 90 seconds. Then he straightened up, walked back around to the driver's side, and opened the car's door. He reached in with the flathead. There was a faint click. Then he pressed the start button. The Vector X9 came to life. Not gradually, instantly. The electric drive systems initialized with a sound like a building's ventilation system coming on, that deep, almost below audible hum of significant energy being channeled through tight tolerances. And then the engine component spooled up, and the gauges lit, and the sound became something richer and more complex, and the exhaust system ticked once as the temperature differential hit the metalwork, and the whole car was suddenly, completely, and obviously alive. The silence in the garage lasted about 4 seconds. Then one of Damien's maintenance staff, a man named Paulo, who had been working on the car for 6 days and had slept badly for most of them, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "What did you do?" Damien asked. Ethan Mercer was standing beside the open driver's door, looking at the dashboard gauges with the calm attention of someone reading a newspaper. He reached in and shut the car off. Just pressed the button, and the car went quiet again, gently this time, systems stepping down in sequence. He straightened up. There's a relay cluster behind the left rear wheel arch. Most of the cluster is standard, fuses and switching relays for the secondary systems. But there's one that's different. Proprietary unit, manufactured specifically for this model. It's a smart relay. It doesn't just switch, it reads input signals and makes routing decisions based on software logic. "I know what the smart relay is," Damien said carefully. "The relay has a protection logic built into it, a kind of failsafe that's supposed to prevent the car from starting if it detects certain fault conditions. Overvoltage, bad sensor data, communication failure between modules, things like that. It's meant to protect the drivetrain." Ethan paused. "The problem is that the relay's logic has a flaw. If a specific set of conditions occur in a specific sequence, and they're conditions that aren't individually faults, they're all within normal operating range. The relay reads the combination as a fault state and locks the startup authorization permanently until the lockout is manually cleared." "How did you clear it?" "With a flathead screwdriver. There's a reset point on the relay housing. It's not in any documentation I've seen, but it's on the unit. One push. The lockout clears." Damien stared at him. "You're telling me that 12 specialists, including 2 factory engineers, couldn't find this?" "I'm telling you the solution was a reset point that Vector didn't document. If you don't know to look for it, you won't find it. And if you don't know what's triggering the lockout, even if you find the reset point, the problem will come back." "Will it come back? In this car?" "Yes. Unless the relay's logic is corrected. The specific sequence of conditions that triggers it, it's not a rare fluke. It'll happen again. Different interval, but it'll happen." Damien Cross looked at the car. Then he looked at Ethan Mercer. "How do you know about a reset point that Vector's own engineers didn't document?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He bent down and picked up his tool bag from the floor, and he zipped the small outer pocket that he'd opened to take out the flathead. "That's a different conversation," he said, "and it's probably one you're going to want to have sitting down." They went inside. Damien's house was the kind of place that made most people aware of the quality of their own shoes. The entry hall alone was larger than some apartments, with a ceiling that rose to 20 feet and a staircase that curved up in a wide arc past a wall of glass that looked out over the Scottsdale landscape. The furniture throughout was minimal and chosen with the specific taste of someone who had hired very good people to help them spend a lot of money with restraint. There were no garish displays, no gold fixtures, no oversized art that wanted to make you feel small, just space and light, and the clean lines of things that cost more than they announced. Reyes brought coffee to the study without being asked. Damien sat behind his desk. Ethan Mercer sat in one of the chairs across from it and set his tool bag on the floor beside him. He didn't lean it against the desk, and he didn't put it on the low table to his side, just set it down in the space beside his right leg where it was out of the way. "How do you know about the relay?" Damien asked again, once the coffee was poured and Reyes had left the room. Ethan picked up his coffee mug and looked at it for a moment. "I designed it," he said. The study was quiet. Through the glass wall behind Damien's desk, the morning light was bright and coming in at an angle that lit up the edge of the desktop. "You designed the smart relay," Damien said. "The core logic, yes. The routing architecture, the protection protocol, the failsafe system. I developed it in 2016 and 2017 as part of a joint venture with a business partner named Alan Rourke. The intention was to license it to automotive manufacturers for use in high-performance hybrid and electric drivetrains. Ethan set his coffee down. We had the patent filed by early 2018. It covered the core architecture. Damien said nothing. Somewhere in 2019, Ethan continued, while I was dealing with some personal difficulties, I was going through a bad period, not relevant to the details, but relevant to the timing. Alan transferred the patent to Crossline Dynamic Systems. A pause. Your company, Mr. Cross. The study stayed quiet. The transfer was completed on paper, Ethan said. The problem is that the patent was jointly owned. Under the terms of our original agreement and under patent law, a transfer of jointly owned intellectual property requires the consent of both owners. Alan signed the transfer. I didn't. I didn't even know about it. Damien Cross leaned back in his chair very slightly. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A subtle adjustment, the kind that happens when a person's body responds to information before their face has decided what to do with it. That's a significant claim, he said. It is. And you're making it to me. In my house. This morning. You asked me how I knew about the relay, Ethan said. That's how. Damien looked at him for a moment. The worn boots, the tool bag on the floor, the face that was doing nothing in particular, not performing anything, not trying to seem unafraid or significant or calculated. Why did you come here? Damien asked. If what you're saying is true, and I'm not accepting that it is, why would you come here and fix the car before you made the claim? You had leverage. You could have sat on the diagnosis. I don't do that. Most people would. Most people would, Ethan agreed without any particular judgment in it. I'm not most people. He picked up his coffee again. Also, sitting on a diagnosis doesn't fix the underlying problem. The relay flaw is still there. The car will lock again. What I did this morning is temporary. It'll hold for a while, but the logic error is still in the unit. And the only person who can fix the logic error is the person who designed the logic, Damien said slowly. That's about right. Damien Cross looked out the window for a moment. Past the glass, the landscape was dry and gold and still, a saguaro cactus throwing a long morning shadow across a gravel path. I want you to understand something, he said, turning back. I've had lawyers try to come at my company on IP matters before. Big firms, serious people with serious resources. If you think you're going to sit across from me in my own house and make claims, I'm not making claims right now, Ethan said. I'm answering your question. You asked how I knew about the relay. That's how I knew. He set down the mug. What happens after this is a separate matter. And what do you think happens after this? Ethan Mercer looked at him. Not with anger, not with performance, just with the particular flatness of a person who has thought about something for a long time and arrived at a place of complete clarity about it. I think, he said, that someone is going to have to look at some documents. And I think when they look at them, some things are going to be very clear. He stood up, reached down for his tool bag, and settled the strap on his shoulder. I'll send you a written report on the relay issue, what's causing the lockout, and what would need to be corrected in the logic to prevent it recurring. You can forward it to Vector. He looked at Damien. No charge for this morning. I told you I'd pay your rate. I know you did. He moved toward the door. When you've looked at the documents, Mr. Cross, if you want to continue the conversation, you know how to reach me. He walked out of the study. Damien heard his footsteps in the hallway, and then, after a moment, the distant sound of the side door. And then the sound of an 11-year-old truck starting up in the drive. He sat there for a while after that. The coffee was still warm. The light through the window had moved slightly as the morning progressed, the saguaro's shadow turning a few degrees across the gravel path. He picked up his phone and called his chief legal counsel. I need you in Scottsdale by end of day, he said, and bring whoever you trust most on IP. He hung up and sat back and looked out at the landscape for a long time, and the thing sitting in his chest was not quite fear, and not quite anger, and not quite something he had a clean name for. Outside, in the garage, the Vector X9 sat in its center bay, quiet again now, its perfect body catching the light from the museum-grade rigs above it. All that power and precision and engineered beauty resting on the floor of a room that cost more to build than most people earned in a decade. Waiting. The way certain truths wait. Patient, immovable, and entirely indifferent to how long it takes for someone to finally pay attention. Damien Cross did not sleep well on Wednesday night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the one that had driven him into the garage 6 days ago. That earlier sleeplessness had been the clean anxiety of a man with a complicated board meeting ahead of him. Manageable, familiar, the kind of pressure he had learned to metabolize over 20 years of building something large. This was different. This was the kind of wakefulness that comes when a piece of information has entered your body and your body doesn't know what to do with it yet, and so it simply refuses to go offline until it figures out whether the thing is dangerous. He lay in the dark for a while, and then he got up and sat in the chair by the window in his bedroom and looked out at the property. The landscape at night was mostly shadow and suggestion. The dark shapes of saguaros against a sky that was never quite fully dark this close to the city. The gravel paths catching a faint reflected light from somewhere. He sat there for probably an hour before he accepted that he wasn't going to arrive at any useful conclusion through staring at cactus silhouettes, and went back to bed. In the morning, his legal counsel arrived. There were 2 of them. Marcus Webb, who had been Crossline's head of legal for 9 years, and who Damien trusted with the company's most sensitive matters the way you trust a surgeon, not because you like them especially, but because you have watched them perform under pressure and you know what their hands are capable of. And beside Marcus came a woman named Diane Cho, who was a partner at an outside IP firm that Crossline used for complex litigation and licensing matters, and who had a reputation in the field that made opposing counsel visibly uncomfortable in depositions. She was small and dressed with a precision that suggested she thought about everything with the same care, and she had brought a roller case that she handled herself without waiting for anyone to take it from her. They sat in the study. Damien told them what Ethan Mercer had said. He told it without editorializing, just the sequence of events, the diagnosis, the fix, the claim about the relay's origin, the name Alan Rourke, the assertion about the patent transfer. He'd written notes after Ethan left, and he read from them to make sure he wasn't paraphrasing in ways that might distort the details. When he was done, Marcus Webb was quiet for a moment, doing the thing he always did when processing something serious, which was to look at a fixed point on the desk in front of him with an expression of complete stillness. "Tell me about the Rourke acquisition," Diane Cho said. She was looking at Damien directly, not at her notes. "In 2019, we acquired a package of intellectual property from a company called Rourke Technical Partners. It was a relatively small transaction by our standards at the time. I want to say the total was somewhere around $8 million for the IP package, which included several patents and 2 pending applications. One of the patents in the package was the smart relay architecture. Our licensing division developed it further and began licensing it to manufacturers starting in 2021. Did you personally review the acquisition documents?" "My team reviewed them. Marcus was involved at the back end." Marcus nodded without looking up. "The transfer documentation appeared complete. The patent was listed as solely owned by Rourke Technical Partners at the time of the transaction. There was no indication of a co-inventor or joint ownership." "Appeared complete," Diane said. "The original filing," Marcus said carefully, listed Alan Rourke as sole inventor. If there was a co-inventor who had been removed from the filing at some point prior to our acquisition, or if the ownership had been restructured in a way that wasn't reflected in the public record, that wouldn't have been visible to us through standard due diligence. And you did standard due diligence, Diane said. It wasn't quite a question. Marcus looked at her for a moment. We did the due diligence appropriate to the transaction size and risk profile at the time. The room was quiet. Damien said, "The question I want answered before anything else is whether the man is real, whether the claim has any foundation at all, because it's entirely possible that he found the reset point on the relay by luck or by some knowledge he's accumulated through working on similar systems, and the rest of the story is constructed around that." "That's possible," Diane said, "but it's also possible it's not." "Yes," she said. "It's also possible it's not." She opened her roller case and took out a laptop. "Do you have a full name and a last known address?" "Ethan Mercer. His business is called Mercer Automotive. He's in Deering." Damien gave her what he had. She typed without looking at the keyboard. "I want the original patent filing," she said to Marcus. "Not the version in our acquisition documents. The original filing at the USPTO. I want to know if there are any amendment records, any assignment records, any co-inventor petitions filed or withdrawn. Everything in the file wrapper." "I can have that today." "I want it this morning." Marcus made a note. Ethan Mercer, in the meantime, drove back to Deering. It was a 2-hour drive from the Cross property to his garage, and he made it mostly in silence. He didn't listen to music when he was thinking, which was a habit that people who knew him found strange but had stopped remarking on. The truck's cab was quiet except for the sound of the road and the slight vibration in the chassis that came from a right rear wheel bearing he'd been meaning to replace for about 6 weeks and kept not getting around to because other things came up. His garage was a 2-bay operation on the south end of Deering's main commercial strip, which was 4 blocks long and contained, among other things, a hardware store, a diner, a barbershop, a feed supply place that had been there since before Ethan was born, and a real estate office that seemed to mostly exist as a place for 2 older men to sit and drink coffee and look out the window. The garage was not impressive from the outside. A flat-roofed building in a sandy tan that had once been closer to cream, with a hand-painted sign above the bays that said Mercer Auto in letters that had been touched up maybe 3 times over the years without quite returning to their original crispness. The landscaping was gravel and 2 scraggly desert shrubs that survived on rain alone. Inside, it was different. Not flashier, not cleaner in any decorative sense, but organized in the specific way that serious working spaces get organized over years of use, where every tool has a location. It returns to, and the locations have been refined over time by the logic of actual work rather than the logic of how work is supposed to look. The diagnostic equipment on the shelf along the back wall was current and well maintained. The reference binders on the side shelf were worn but complete, and they had handwritten tabs on them in Ethan's own notation system that only he could fully read. There was a pegboard of specialty tools, and on the floor near the second bay, a hydraulic floor jack that he'd bought used 15 years ago and rebuilt twice and trusted completely. His assistant, a 26-year-old named Cody, who had come to Ethan 2 years ago knowing almost nothing about automotive systems and had since become genuinely useful, was under a 2017 pickup in the first bay when Ethan came in. He rolled out from under it when he heard the truck. "How'd it go?" Cody asked. "Fixed it." "Yeah?" Cody wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at Ethan with the particular curiosity of a young person who's been given partial information and is trying to fill in the rest. "What was wrong with it?" "Relay lockout. There's a reset point on the unit that clears it." "On the Vector relay? I didn't think Vector published that." "They don't." Cody thought about that for a moment. "So how'd you know?" Ethan set his bag down on the workbench. "There's a folder in the upper left drawer of my desk. Bring it out here." Cody disappeared into the small office at the back and came back with a manila folder that was thick enough that the edges had started to soften and curl from being handled over years. Ethan took it and set it on the workbench and opened it. Inside were documents, printouts, some of them old enough that the ink had faded in patches, and photographs of documents, and some handwritten pages in a technical shorthand that filled the margins as well as the lines. "What is all that?" Cody asked. "Work I did about 7 or 8 years ago," Ethan said. He turned a few pages, looking at them with the careful attention of someone checking that a thing is still where they left it. "Before I came here," Cody was quiet for a moment, reading the room. He was smart enough to know when to ask more questions and when to give a thing space. "You need anything?" he said. "Handle the pickup," Ethan said. "Call Mrs. Garza about her Civic. She's been waiting on the parts since Monday. I'll be in the office." He took the folder and went inside. Basab. What Ethan did in the office for the next 2 hours was something he had done before, 3 or 4 times over the years, in the disciplined and slightly dissociating way that you approach a thing you know you'll eventually have to deal with, but have been leaving at arm's length because approaching it requires a specific kind of readiness. He organized the documents. He had most of what he needed. His own design notes from 2016 and 2017, the email exchanges with Alan Rourke from that period, the draft patent claims he'd written in the months before the filing, and several letters from the attorney they'd used for the original application. What he was looking at was the record of a thing he'd built, the logic architecture for a smart relay system that could make routing decisions based on real-time sensor input, with a layered protection protocol that prevented it from taking actions that would damage the systems it was protecting. It was an elegant design. He could see that even now, looking at sketches he'd made on legal pad in a rental apartment in Phoenix, during a winter when he hadn't been sleeping well for reasons that had nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with a marriage that was coming apart in slow motion. He set aside the design documents and pulled out the ownership section of the folder. The original patent application had listed both his name and Alan's as co-inventors. The claims were divided along logical lines: Ethan's core architecture, Alan's implementation refinements. That had been accurate. The thing had genuinely been a collaboration, though an unequal one in terms of original conception. Alan had been the business person, the one with the industry connections and the capital, and Ethan had been the engineer. It was a common enough pairing. He had gone through the personal difficulties in late 2018 and 2019. His wife had left. He had moved out of Phoenix. He'd spent about 4 months working as a day laborer on a construction crew in Tucson because he needed to do something with his hands that wasn't thinking, and then he drifted to Deering when a truck needed roadside attention on the highway nearby, and the man who owned the truck turned out to own the garage that was for sale and had decided on the spot that he wanted to sell it to someone who clearly knew what they were doing. He hadn't been thinking about the patent. He hadn't been thinking about much beyond getting through the week. He'd found out about the transfer 18 months after it happened, when a former contact from the Phoenix tech scene had sent him a news item about cross-line dynamic systems, announcing a new licensing program for an advanced smart relay architecture for hybrid and EV powertrains. The item had included a technical description that was very familiar. He'd looked up the patent record, and there it was. Reassigned to Crossline, with Alan Rourke listed as the sole inventor. He had called Alan. That conversation was one of the things Ethan tried not to think about too often, because it had the quality of something that leaves a mark. Alan had answered, which Ethan had not expected, and the first few seconds of the conversation had been the false warmth of a person who doesn't yet know what's coming. When Ethan told him what he was looking at, the warmth stopped. "I moved forward with the company," Alan had said. "I had an opportunity and I took it. You transferred a jointly owned patent without my consent. You were gone, Ethan. You fell off the face of the earth. I couldn't reach you. You didn't try." A pause. "I tried." "You didn't." Ethan had been very calm on the phone, which was something he was almost always capable of even when the situation was not calm. "We had an agreement and you broke it, and you falsified the ownership record to make the transfer possible. That's a serious accusation." "It's an accurate one." Another pause, longer this time. "What are you planning to do?" Ethan had thought about that for a moment. "I don't know yet," he'd said, and he'd hung up. That had been almost 4 years ago. What he had done in the intervening time was a slow accumulation, gathering documents, making copies of things he still had, tracking down the patent file history through public records, making careful notes. He had consulted a lawyer once, briefly, a woman in Tucson who did IP work and who had told him that his case had real substance, but that pursuing it against a company the size of Crossline would take resources he didn't have and would take years. He had put the folder back in the drawer. He had continued working on trucks and Hondas and the occasional exotic that found its way to him through the thin network of people who knew what he was actually capable of, and the folder had stayed in the drawer right where it was, until a man named Jeffrey Pratt called and said he had a client with a Vector X9 that no one could start. Ethan had almost said no. He'd thought about it for most of the evening after the call, sitting in the small house he rented 2 streets over from the garage, eating leftover chili from a pot on the stove, and listening to the wind move through the single cottonwood tree in the backyard. He'd thought about what it would mean to walk into Damian Cross's garage, a man whose company had built significant revenue on the relay technology, who had the resources to fight anything Ethan brought against him indefinitely, who operated in a world where Ethan was so far outside the frame of reference that the mechanic showing up would be at best a curiosity. But the relay flaw was real, and it was his flaw. Not in the sense that it was his mistake, but in the sense that it was his architecture, and he understood why it was doing what it was doing, and there was something in him that couldn't leave a machine broken when he knew how to fix it. So he'd gone. But Marcus Webb called at 2 in the afternoon. Ethan was under the hood of a Subaru Outback when his phone rang. He wiped his hands and answered. "Mr. Mercer," Marcus said, "I'm calling on behalf of Damian Cross. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm the head of legal for Crossline Dynamic Systems." "Okay," Ethan said. "We've had a chance to begin reviewing the matters you raised with Mr. Cross yesterday morning, and we'd like to schedule a conversation with you. Formal setting, both parties' legal representation present." "I don't have a lawyer." A brief pause. "You may want to retain one before we meet." "Probably," Ethan agreed. "We're prepared to move quickly on scheduling." "I imagine you are." Ethan leaned against the Subaru and looked at the ceiling of the bay. "Mr. Webb, before we schedule anything, did you pull the original patent file from the USPTO?" Another pause. Longer. "We're in the process of reviewing relevant documentation. The file wrapper will show you the amendment history. The original application listed 2 inventors. There's a record of the co-inventor being removed from the filing before the assignment was made to your company. That's in the public record." Ethan paused. "I'm not trying to ambush anyone. I just want you to know that I've looked at this carefully." Silence on the line. "Mr. Mercer," Marcus said, and now his voice had changed slightly. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way that a person's voice changes when they've just been told something that reorients their understanding of the terrain. "How long have you been preparing this?" "Since I found out about the transfer," Ethan said. 4 years, roughly." More silence. "I'd still recommend you retain counsel before any formal meeting," Marcus said. "I appreciate that. We'll be in touch about scheduling." They hung up. Ethan stood there for a moment, phone in his hand, and then put it back in his pocket and went back to the Subaru. Damian Cross was in his home office when Marcus came in and closed the door behind him. Damian had been reading the technical description of the relay patent, the actual filing language, which he'd requested from Marcus's office after the morning meeting, and which had arrived by email just before noon. He wasn't an engineer, but he'd spent 20 years in the technology business, and he could read technical documents with enough fluency to understand their structure and follow their claims. He'd been reading it for an hour, and the thing that was sitting in him had gotten heavier. Marcus sat down across from the desk. "Tell me," Damian said. "The file wrapper is complicated," Marcus said. He set a printout on the desk. A multi-page document, dense, with USPTO headers. The original application in 2018 listed 2 inventors, Alan Rourke and Ethan Mercer. 7 months before the assignment to us, a petition was filed to amend the inventorship, removing Mercer from the listing. The petition cited a declaration from Rourke stating that Mercer had not contributed patentable subject matter. Damian looked at the printout. "The petition was granted," Marcus continued. "The amended application listed Rourke as sole inventor, and that's the version that appeared in our acquisition documents." He paused. "But Mercer would have had the right to contest that petition. There's no record of him being notified. And the original claims, the core architectural claims, which are the ones our licensing program is built on, those are the claims that Mercer's name was on in the original application." The study was very quiet. "So when we acquired the patent from Rourke," Damian said slowly, "we acquired a patent whose inventorship had been amended through a process that may not have been—" "That's the question," Marcus said carefully. "That's a yes or no question, Marcus." Marcus looked at him steadily. "If the inventorship amendment was fraudulent, if Rourke falsely declared that Mercer hadn't contributed patentable subject matter, then the amended patent is vulnerable. The ownership assignment based on the amended patent is vulnerable. And our licensing revenue." "Yes." Damian set down the printout. He looked at his desk for a moment, at the clean surface of it, at the neat geometry of the things on it, at the way he'd always arranged his workspace to suggest a kind of order that he could control. "Did we know?" he asked. Marcus looked at him. "I don't believe anyone on our team had specific knowledge of the fraudulent amendment at the time of acquisition." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "The due diligence we conducted was standard for the transaction size. There were elements of the file wrapper that, in retrospect, might have warranted closer examination. The timing of the inventorship amendment, for example. 7 months before an assignment is unusual. It wasn't flagged. Damien stood up and walked to the window. The desert afternoon outside was bright and flat and dry, the kind of light that made everything look slightly overexposed. "What does he actually have?" Damien asked without turning. "Mercer, what does he have in his hands right now?" He indicated to me on the phone that he has the original application documents, correspondence from the period, and he's clearly familiar with the file wrapper. If he has the original design documentation, drafts, notes, email exchanges from before the filing, that's potentially very significant. "He'd have it," Damien said. "He's the kind of person who keeps things." He didn't explain how he knew this. He just knew. There had been something in the man's manner, the worn folder, the flat unhurriedness of him, that was the manner of someone who had been careful about something for a long time. He turned back from the window. "I want to know one more thing," he said. "The relay flaw. The logic error that causes the lockout. Mercer said the fix was a reset point that Vector hadn't documented. Is that in the patent claims?" Marcus hesitated. "I had Diane look at it," Marcus said. "The protection protocol architecture, but including the fail-safe logic and its reset mechanism, is in the original claims, the claims that Mercer's name was on." Damien Cross absorbed that. The Vector X9 had been started that morning by the man who had originally designed the system that told it when it was allowed to run. The 12 specialists who had come before, the factory engineers with their proprietary diagnostic tools, Harlan Becks with his $800 an hour and his decades of motorsport experience, none of them had known about the reset point because the reset point was in the architecture, and the architecture had belonged to someone whose name had been removed from the record. He thought about the car sitting in the center bay of the garage. $4 million of engineering that had been silent for 6 days because of a flaw in its own protection logic. A flaw that the man who designed the logic had walked in and cleared with a flathead screwdriver in 90 seconds. "Set up the meeting," Damien said. "And Marcus, tell your people to read everything. I don't want to walk into a room without knowing exactly what we're sitting across from." Marcus nodded and left. Damien turned back to the window. In the distance, past the edge of the property, there was a highway he could just barely see. A faint movement of traffic, cars and trucks going somewhere at speed. He watched it for a moment and thought about a man driving a faded Navy truck back to a 4-block town, carrying a worn leather bag, knowing something that no one with 100 times his resources had been able to find. The thought that settled in him was not quite guilt. It was something more complicated than guilt and less comfortable. A slow recognition that the story he'd been told when his company acquired that patent, the story he'd accepted without asking enough questions, might have had a different story underneath it the whole time, and that the man who'd shown up with nothing but a flat head and a quiet voice had been carrying that different story for 4 years, patient as the desert, waiting for a moment when the car refused to start and the world finally had to stop and listen. He picked up the patent filing from his desk and carried it with him out of the office, down the hall, and into the garage. He stood in front of the Vector for a long time. He didn't touch it. He just stood there and looked at the relay cluster access panel behind the left rear wheel arch, and the faint marks where Ethan's flathead screwdriver had engaged the reset point, and thought about everything that a $4 million machine didn't know about the hands that had made it possible. The lawyer Ethan eventually retained was not the kind of lawyer that came recommended by anyone in a position of power. Her name was Sandra Voss, and she ran a 2-person practice out of a strip mall in Tucson, in an office sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a cell phone repair shop. She was 51 years old, had graduated from a state law school that nobody put on a list of the best anywhere, and had spent the first decade of her career doing patent work for a mid-sized manufacturing firm before going out on her own when the firm dissolved. She drove a car that needed a new muffler and kept her office at a temperature that was about 4 degrees too warm, and the first time Ethan sat across from her desk, she looked at his folder for 45 minutes without saying a single word to him. Then she looked up and said, "This is real." "I know it's real," Ethan said. "I was there." "No, I mean..." She set down the documents and took off her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I mean, the case is real. I've seen people come in here with what they think is a solid IP claim, and it turns out to be a misunderstanding or a documentation gap or wishful thinking. This isn't that. She tapped the folder. The original application language, the timing of the inventorship amendment, the design notes that predate the filing. This is a coherent record of someone who was cut out of something they built. So you'll take it. She looked at him. I'll take it. I want to be direct with you about something first. I'm not a big firm. I don't have the resources to go 20 rounds with Crossline's legal department on equal footing in terms of sheer mass. What I have is the ability to be very precise, and a contact at a litigation finance firm that takes IP cases on contingency when the underlying claim is strong enough. If your documentation holds up to deeper scrutiny, and I believe it will, we may be able to get funding that levels the field. How long will all of that take? To get the funding, 2 to 3 weeks if I push, to actually resolve the matter? She picked up her glasses and put them back on. That depends entirely on how Crossline responds. If they fight everything, years. If they look at what you have and decide that fighting is more expensive than settling, it could be much faster. Ethan thought about that. They already pulled the patent file. The head of legal called me 2 days ago. He knew about the inventorship amendment. They're doing their own assessment, Sandra said. That's actually a good sign. It means they're not in denial. They're trying to figure out how bad the exposure is. She leaned back in her chair. Did they seem like they wanted to settle? I don't know what they want yet. Well, she said, let's find out. Us out. The formal meeting happened 11 days after Ethan had walked out of Damian Cross's study. It took place in a conference room in a law office in Phoenix. Neutral ground technically, though the office belonged to a firm that Crossline used regularly, and the conference room had that specific quality of rooms that expensive lawyers use a lot. The long table with the leather chairs, the credenza with the water pitchers, the abstract art on the walls that exists specifically to not provoke any feeling whatsoever. Sandra Voss came in with her roller bag and her too-warm office temperature somehow still emanating from her, and sat up at one end of the table. Ethan sat beside her. He wore the cleanest clothes he owned that weren't work clothes, dark slacks, a collared shirt, boots that he'd actually cleaned the night before with a brush, and some saddle soap. Cross-lined side of the table was 3 people, Marcus Webb, Diane Cho, and a third attorney named Patterson, who was introduced as a specialist in patent litigation and who said nothing for the first 20 minutes other than his name. Damian Cross was not in the room. Ethan had half expected him to be, and his absence was a kind of statement, a signal that Crossline was treating this as a legal matter rather than a personal one, at least officially. Whether that was a posture or a genuine disposition remained to be seen. Marcus Webb opened. He was precise and formal, and expressed the company's position in the measured language of someone who has thought carefully about every word they're about to say. Crossline had acquired the patent in good faith through a properly documented transaction. The inventorship record at the time of acquisition had listed Alan Rourke as the sole inventor. The company had no knowledge of any prior co-inventor claims, and while they were prepared to engage in a good faith conversation about the matter, they were not in a position at this stage to concede any element of the claim. Sandra Voss listened to all of this with the attentiveness of someone counting something. When Marcus finished, she opened her roller bag and placed a stack of documents in the center of the table. I appreciate the position, she said. Let me show you what we have. What she showed them was organized in the way that only a person who has been thinking about the structure of an argument for 11 days straight can organize something. First, the original patent application, the full filing with both names on it. Then a timeline, single page, clean, showing the dates of every significant event. The filing, the email exchanges between Ethan and Alan Rourke during the development period, the inventorship amendment petition, and the assignment to Crossline. The timeline made the sequence visible in a way that reading documents individually didn't. You could see, laid out in simple chronology, that the amendment had happened 7 months before the assignment, and that the amendment had removed a name that had been on the filing for over a year before that. Then the design documents. Ethan's handwritten notes from 2016, dated by the paper itself and by the context of references in them. References to software versions, to industry standards that had existed at specific times, to conversations with suppliers whose records could be independently verified. The notes were not pretty. They were working documents full of crossed-out lines and margin calculations and the occasional coffee ring, but they were coherent and they were unambiguous about what they were, the working record of someone building something. Then the emails. Between Ethan and Alan during the development phase, between them and the original patent attorney, between Alan and the attorney in the months before the inventorship amendment petition, emails in which Alan's language shifted in ways that were subtle, but once you were looking for them, visible. He stopped using we and started using I. References to shared decisions became references to his own decisions, and one email in particular, sent from Alan to the patent attorney 4 months before the amendment petition, in which Alan wrote, in reference to the core architectural claims, "I need these under my name alone before we move forward with the acquisition discussion. Handle it." Sandra set that email in front of Marcus Webb and left it there without saying anything about it. The room was quiet for a moment. "We'd need to verify the authenticity of these documents," Diane Cho said. "Of course," Sandra said. "We're prepared to submit everything to forensic examination, metadata, paper dating, server records for the emails. We welcome it." She paused. "We'd also note that the email I've just shown you is not solely in our possession. The original patent attorney, whose name is David Fitch, and who left the practice where he handled this filing approximately 2 years after the amendment, has been in contact with us. He has his own records." Patterson, the silent specialist, wrote something on the pad in front of him. "We're also aware," Sandra continued, "of the licensing revenue Crossline has generated from this patent since 2021. We have the public licensing announcements, the reported contract values, and a preliminary estimate of the revenue attributable to the specific claims that originated with Mr. Mercer's work. I won't put a number on the table today because we're still developing that analysis, but the figure is significant." Marcus Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan was sitting with his hands on the table in front of him, not doing anything with them, just sitting. He looked back at Marcus with the same flat, unperformed steadiness he'd had in the garage and in the study. He wasn't angry, wasn't triumphant, wasn't nervous. He was just there, present, the way a person is present when they've been carrying a thing long enough that the weight of it has become ordinary. "Mr. Mercer," Marcus said, "I have to ask you directly. What is it that you want from this?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Recognition," he said. "My name on the record where it belongs. Royalties for future licensing, at a fair rate. And the historical licensing, what was earned from the work I did, that needs to be addressed too." "You're not looking to take the company down." "That was never what this was." Marcus exchanged a look with Diane that lasted about a second and a half. And in that second and a half, Ethan saw something shift, not dramatically, but the way the light shifts when a cloud moves, a change in the quality of the room's attention. "We'll need time to review these materials in detail," Marcus said. "We understand that," Sandra said. "We're available." The review took 3 weeks. For Ethan, those 3 weeks were mostly the same as every other 3 weeks. Trucks and sedans and the occasional luxury car that found its way to him. Cody learning things and making mistakes and learning from them. Mrs. Garza's Civic finally fixed once the parts came in, and her gratitude expressed in the form of a ceramic dish of tamales left on the workbench with a post-it note that said, "Thank you, Ethan," in letters large enough to be read from across the bay. He called Sandra every few days. She said they were waiting. He said okay, and went back to work. But underneath the ordinary surface of the days, there was a current, a low tension that he'd learned to live alongside, but that didn't go away. He thought about the meeting sometimes when he was under a car and couldn't think about anything else. He thought about the email, "Handle it," and what those 2 words had cost him. The 4 years in Deering, which he didn't entirely regret because Deering had given him something that the Phoenix period hadn't, a quieter kind of life that he'd come to value. But the version of those 4 years that might have existed if he'd known earlier, if he'd had the resources to do something sooner, that version lived in him as a kind of permanent counterfactual that he didn't dwell on but couldn't fully close the door on either. He thought about Alan Rourke. He hadn't spoken to Alan since that phone call 4 years ago. The brief, cold conversation in which Alan had said he'd tried to reach Ethan and Ethan had said he hadn't, and both of them had known exactly which one of them was telling the truth and which one wasn't. He didn't know where Alan was now. Sandra had tracked him down as part of the case preparation. Alan was in Denver, apparently, running another small technology consultancy. He had not yet been contacted as part of the legal matter, but that was coming. What Ethan felt about Alan was not clean. It was not pure anger, though anger was in it. It was something more worn and complex. The feeling of looking back at a person you'd trusted and finding that the trust had been a kind of innocence you couldn't get back. Alan had been his partner for 3 years before everything fell apart. They'd worked well together in the practical sense. Alan could open doors that Ethan couldn't, and Ethan could build things that Alan could only sketch the outlines of. There had been genuine respect between them at the beginning. And then the marriage had started failing, and the difficult period had set in, and Ethan had stepped back from everything, and Alan had apparently decided that the stepping back was an opportunity. The thing that was hardest to sit with was not that Alan had done it. People did things like this. The world contained plenty of people who, when given access and opportunity and a partner who wasn't watching, made the choice that served themselves. Ethan understood that intellectually. What was harder was the specific experience of knowing that your absence, your pain, the worst period of your life, had been the condition that made the taking possible. That while he had been in Tucson driving nails into framing lumber and trying to remember what kind of person he was, someone else had been quietly removing his name from the record of something he'd built. He didn't talk about this with anyone. Not with Cody, not with Sandra, not with the handful of people endearing he was close enough to that they noticed when something was weighing on him. He just carried it the way he carried most things, internally, without performance, the way a vehicle carries weight in its frame rather than on its surface. On a Thursday morning in week 3, Sandra called at 7:15 while he was making coffee. "They found something else," she said. Her voice had the specific quality of controlled excitement that he'd noticed she got when information arrived that changed the shape of the thing. "Something we didn't have." "Tell me." "A woman named Natalie Brooks. She was executive assistant to the CEO, to Cross, during the period of the acquisition. She left the company in 2021. She's been contacted by Crossline's legal team as part of their internal review, which means they're trying to figure out what she knows before we do." "What does she know?" "According to a preliminary conversation she had with a mutual contact of mine last night, and this is preliminary, so hold it loosely. She was present for at least 2 internal meetings in 2019 in which the acquisition of the Rourke patent was discussed. And in those meetings, questions were apparently raised about the inventorship amendment. Someone on the internal team flagged it explicitly." Ethan set down his coffee mug. "It was noted," Sandra continued, "reviewed, and then set aside. The acquisition moved forward." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the cottonwood tree was moving slightly in an early morning breeze, its leaves catching the low light. "So they knew," Ethan said. "Someone knew. Whether that goes up to Cross directly is the question, and it's the question Natalie Brooks can answer." A pause. "She's willing to talk to us." "Why?" "She said she left the company because of this." "Not entirely. There were other things, but this was part of it. She raised the concern internally and was told it wasn't her area, and she had a conversation with someone senior about it that left a bad enough taste in her mouth that she started looking for other employment about 4 months later." Sandra paused. "She's not doing this out of spite. From what I can tell, she's doing it because she's been uncomfortable about it for 4 years and she's ready to stop carrying it." Ethan thought about that. A person who'd been carrying something uncomfortable for 4 years and had finally decided to set it down. He understood that feeling better than most. "Set it up," he said. Natalie Brooks was 38 and lived in Tempe, and she met Sandra and Ethan at a coffee shop that was busy enough to be anonymous. She was a composed woman who wore her composure the way some people wear a good coat. It fit her well, but you could see it was something she'd put on rather than something that grew naturally from what was underneath. She ordered a tea and didn't touch it for the first 10 minutes. "I want to be clear about something before we start," she said. She was addressing both of them, but her eyes moved mostly between Sandra and a point on the table between them. "I'm not here to burn anyone. I don't have an agenda. I was asked a direct question by your colleague about what I know, and I've thought about it for a week, and what I've decided is that I've been holding information that belongs in the right place, and the right place is with you." "We appreciate that," Sandra said. Natalie looked at Ethan for a moment. "You're the inventor," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. She picked up her tea, seemed to remember she hadn't wanted it yet, and set it back down. "In the fall of 2019, I sat in on an acquisition review meeting. It was early in my time with the company. I'd been in the role about 8 months. The meeting was about the Rourke IP package. Legal was presenting their due diligence summary. I was there to take notes and manage follow-up items." She paused and gathered herself in the way people do when they're about to say something they've thought about saying for a long time. Partway through the presentation, one of the junior attorneys, a man named Cresswell, he left the company a year or so after I did. He flagged the inventorship amendment. He said the timing was unusual and that the petition documentation had some anomalies he wanted to note for the record. He wasn't saying don't do the deal. He was saying be aware of this, it might warrant a closer look. "And what happened?" Sandra asked. Marcus Webb said they'd reviewed it and were satisfied with the title chain. End of that discussion. Natalie looked at her tea. "But after the meeting, I was pulling together the notes, and I saw that Cresswell had sent a follow-up email to Marcus with a more detailed breakdown of his concerns. He'd done more research in the day or two before the meeting. He'd found the original application with 2 names on it. He'd noted that the gap between the inventorship amendment and the assignment was 7 months. He'd pulled the petition documentation and flagged specific language in the declaration that he said was, I'm quoting from what I remember, potentially unsupportable given the original claim structure." "And Marcus's response to that email?" Sandra said. Natalie was quiet for a moment. "I saw it because it came through the executive correspondence queue. I wasn't supposed to read it. I was just routing it. But I read it." She looked up. Marcus forwarded it to a senior member of the acquisitions team with a note that said to proceed and that Cresswell's concerns were noted but that the business rationale for the acquisition was sound and the legal risk was within acceptable parameters. The coffee shop moved around them, the sound of espresso machines and other people's conversations, a door opening and letting in a wedge of Tempe afternoon heat before closing again. "Was Cross CC'd on any of that?" Sandra asked. "Not directly, but there was a separate briefing document, a 1-pager that went to Cross before he signed off on the acquisition. I prepared the routing for it. It summarized the key points of the legal review." She stopped. "Was the inventorship question in the 1-pager? Natalie looked at Ethan. There was a line, one line. It said the patent had undergone an inventorship amendment prior to acquisition and that counsel had reviewed and was satisfied with the title chain. She paused. It didn't say what the amendment was or why it happened or that a member of the legal team had raised concerns. It said counsel was satisfied. Ethan absorbed this slowly. One line, buried in a briefing document, technically present, technically disclosed, and completely stripped of the context that would have made it mean anything to the man who read it and signed off. "Did Cross read the 1-pager himself?" Ethan asked. "He always read his briefing documents," Natalie said. "He was very specific about that. He didn't like summaries of summaries. He read the source materials when he had them, and when he didn't have time for source materials, he read the 1-pager and expected it to be accurate." She picked up the tea finally and took a small sip. Whether the 1-pager he got was accurate is a different question. The implication sat in the air between all three of them. "I have the emails," Natalie said. "Cresswell's follow-up, Marcus's forward, the routing sheet for the briefing document. I kept copies when I left because I knew—" She stopped herself, started again. "I knew I might need to have the conversation I'm having right now someday." Sandra was making notes without looking at the page. "We'd need everything you have, in whatever form you have it." "I know. That's why I'm here." The second meeting with Crossline's legal team happened 4 days later. This time, it was at Crossline's own offices, a building in Scottsdale not far from the Cross property, 10 floors of glass and steel, with a lobby that announced its own importance in the way that corporate lobbies do. All atrium and branded signage, and the particular hush of climate control working very hard. Sandra and Ethan were taken up to a conference room on the 8th floor that was larger than the first one and had a view of the desert that would have been peaceful under different circumstances. Marcus Webb was there, and Diane Cho, and Patterson. And this time, at the far end of the table, Damien Cross himself. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, not dramatically so. He was put together in the way that people with his kind of money always manage to be even when they're fraying at the edges, but Ethan noticed the specific flatness around his eyes and the way he was sitting with a stillness that wasn't relaxed, it was contained. He looked at Ethan when they came in and gave a single nod that was not quite an acknowledgement and not quite an apology, and something in between. Sandra put Natalie Brooks' materials on the table. She didn't narrate them extensively. She let Marcus and Diane read. She let Damien Cross read the Cresswell email, and then the forwarding note, and then the routing sheet for the briefing document. She watched his face the way a doctor watches a patient processing a diagnosis. Not with satisfaction, just with the attention of someone who needs to know what they're seeing. Damien Cross read the one-pager briefing document last. He held it for a while after he finished reading it. He turned it over as though there might be something on the back, which there wasn't. "This is what I was given," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "According to Ms. Brooks, yes," Sandra said. He set the page down. He looked at Marcus Webb, and something passed between them that was not comfortable and not brief. "You were aware of Cresswell's concerns," Damien said to Marcus. His voice was very even. "We evaluated the risk and made a business judgment," Marcus said. "A business judgment that you summarized for me as counsel is satisfied." Marcus said nothing. "That's not the same thing," Damien said, still very even. The silence in the room had a texture to it now. Patterson had stopped writing. Diane Cho was looking at the table in front of her with an expression of careful neutrality. Ethan was watching all of this without any particular feeling that he could name cleanly. He had imagined this moment in various forms over 4 years. The moment when the people on the other side of the thing were confronted with the weight of what had been done. He had imagined it with more anger than he felt right now. What he felt right now was something tireder and more complicated. Not forgiveness. He wasn't there, and maybe wouldn't be. But a recognition that the picture was not as simple as a villain and a victim. There was Damien Cross, a man who had built something real and who had been, at least in this specific instance, served a version of the truth that had been shaped by other people's choices. And there was Marcus Webb, who had made a business judgment and called it counsel's satisfaction. And there were all the years in between, and the relay that still had a flaw in its logic, and a $4 million car that had needed a flathead screwdriver to start. "Mr. Cross," Sandra said carefully, "we're not here to litigate intent today. We're here because Mr. Mercer's contribution to this technology is documented. The process by which his name was removed from the record appears to be fraudulent, and your company has been generating licensing revenue from his work for 4 years. Those are the facts we need to address." Damien Cross looked at Ethan. "I want to talk to him," Damien said. "Directly, without the lawyers in the room." Sandra started to object, and Ethan put a hand on her arm lightly. "It's okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment, weighing it. Then, 10 minutes. The attorneys filed out. Both sets of them, which required a brief logistical negotiation between Marcus and Sandra about who went where, resolved by the two of them agreeing to stand in the hallway on opposite sides of the elevator bank. The conference room was left with 2 men and a view of the desert and a table full of documents that told a complicated story about what had happened when one of them wasn't paying attention and the other one wasn't present. Damien Cross said, "Did you know it would come to this when you showed up at my garage?" "I knew it might." "And you fixed the car anyway?" "Yes." Damien looked at him for a moment. "Why?" Ethan thought about the question. It was the same question Damien had asked that morning in the study, and he'd given the same answer then, "I don't do that," which was true, but not complete. "Because the car had a problem, and I knew how to fix it," he said. "That's what I do." He paused. "And because I needed to be in the room, not for leverage. I just needed to be in the room where the thing I built was sitting, and have somebody look at me and ask how I knew about it." He looked at his hands on the table. 4 years is a long time to know something that the official record says isn't true. Damien was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the desert through the conference room glass. "I didn't know," he said, "about the co-inventor. I want you to know that." "I believe you." Ethan said. Do you? You're not a careful enough liar to be sitting here if you'd known. You'd have settled this quietly months ago when we first talked. Ethan met his eyes. Someone managed the information you got. That's a problem inside your organization, not just a problem between us. Something moved across Damien's face at that. Not relief exactly, but the complicated response of a person being accurately seen by someone they expected to only see them one way. What do you actually want? Damien asked. Not what your lawyer said in the meeting. What do you actually want? Ethan considered the question with the same care he gave everything. My name back, he said. On the record, everywhere the technology is used, royalties going forward, fair ones, not charity, and what was earned from my work over the past 4 years, I'm not going to let that disappear, but I'm open to how it gets addressed. He paused. I don't want your company. I don't want to be in this industry. I want to go back to Deering and fix cars and have the record say what the record should say. Damien Cross looked at him for a long moment. That's it? That's it. Outside the conference room, through the glass walls, the desert afternoon was doing what Arizona afternoons do in October. The light softening slightly from its midday harshness, the shadows starting to lengthen incrementally, the landscape settling into a patience that had nothing to do with anything the people in the building were negotiating. Damien Cross stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. Send them back in, he said to no one in particular, and his voice when he said it had a quality that Sandra Voss, filing back into the room 30 seconds later, recognized immediately as the voice of a person who has made a decision and is done examining it from all sides. She caught Ethan's eye across the table. He gave her the smallest nod. She opened her folder to the next section and set her pen on the pad in front of her, and the real negotiation began. The negotiation that followed was not clean or fast or conducted in good faith by everyone at the table simultaneously. That was the first thing Sandra told Ethan when they debriefed in her car in the cross-line parking garage after the second meeting broke up. She told him this without bitterness, just as a statement of operating conditions. The way a mechanic might tell a customer that the road they were about to drive had a rough surface, not to alarm them, just so they'd know what they were dealing with and not be surprised when the ride got uneven. They're going to draw this out, she said. She had the engine running for the air conditioning but hadn't put the car in reverse yet. Not forever. They can't afford forever, not with what we have, but long enough to see if we blink. We're not going to blink, Ethan said. I know, but they need to test that. She glanced at him. Cross made a decision in that room, but Marcus Webb is going to spend the next few weeks trying to find a version of the settlement that limits the company's exposure on the historical licensing as much as possible. That's his job. He's going to do it thoroughly. How much is the historical licensing exposure? Our preliminary estimate is somewhere between $14 and $18 million in revenue attributable to the claims that originated with your work. The actual damages figure in litigation could be higher. There are multipliers available for willful infringement, and the Cresswell email is pretty strong evidence that someone inside the company knew the title chain was questionable. She tapped the steering wheel once. Whether we could get to willful infringement at trial is a separate question, but the threat of it matters for the negotiation. Ethan looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. Level P3, a yellow stripe along the wall at bumper height. The kind of detail that enters your vision when your mind is working on something else. What happens to Marcus Webb? He asked. Sandra looked at him. What do you mean? He made a business judgment. He summarized Cresswell's concerns as counsel is satisfied in a briefing to his employer. That's... Ethan stopped. I'm asking what the consequences are for him. That's an internal matter for Crossline. We're not seeking action against Marcus personally. I know. I'm just asking. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Honestly? Probably not much. He'll be uncomfortable. He may end up transitioning out of the company in the next year or so, framed as a mutual decision. That's usually how it goes. She paused. It's not satisfying. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. She put the car in reverse and backed out of the space, and they left the building and drove into the Scottsdale afternoon. And Ethan looked out the passenger window at the city moving past and thought about all the versions of justice that were available in the world. and how rarely any of them were exactly the shape you needed them to be. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Ethan found both tedious and oddly bearable. Sandra would send documents. Crossline's team would respond with counterproposals. Sandra would analyze the counters, mark them up, call Ethan to walk through the significant points, and they would decide together which positions were negotiable and which weren't. The historical licensing figure was the central battlefield. Crossline's first counterproposal offered a payment of $3 million as a full settlement of all historical claims, a number that was, as Sandra put it with characteristic directness, an insult dressed as a starting point. She responded with a formal letter that was 12 pages long and contained, among other things, a detailed analysis of the Cresswell email's implications for a willful infringement finding, and the counterproposal from Crossline's team that came back 2 weeks later was significantly more serious. Through all of this, Ethan fixed cars. He replaced the wheel bearing on his own truck, finally, on a Saturday morning when the garage was quiet and Cody was off. He did it the way he did everything, methodically, without rushing, aware of each step in the sequence and what it was achieving. The old bearing came off with more resistance than he expected, which meant it had been failing for longer than he'd realized, and he made a note to himself to stop ignoring that particular category of maintenance deferral. He was not always good at caring for the things closest to him. He recognized this as a personal failing and did not spend excessive time flogging himself for it, but tried to do better when he noticed it. Mrs. Garza's son brought in a 20-year-old pickup that needed more work than the truck was probably worth, and Ethan spent an afternoon with him going through the list of what needed to be done and in what order. And the son, 23, working 2 jobs, faced tight with the specific stress of someone who can't afford a car payment, but also can't afford to lose their transportation, made decisions about which repairs to prioritize based on a budget he laid out with the kind of precision that comes from having no margin for error. Ethan did not reduce the labor cost dramatically because that would have been condescending and the young man would have felt it. He found some efficiencies in the part sourcing and passed those along honestly, and when the truck was done it was sound and the young man could afford it, and both of them knew the transaction had been straight. This was the texture of the weeks. Legal process in the background, ordinary work in the foreground. The tension between the two never quite resolving into either triumph or despair. Cody asked once, carefully, in the way he asked things he wasn't sure he had standing to ask, whether Ethan was doing okay. "I'm fine," Ethan said. "You seem like you're thinking about something a lot." "I'm always thinking about something. More than usual, I mean." Ethan looked at him. Cody was holding a torque wrench and managing to look both genuinely concerned and slightly unsure whether he should have said anything. He was a good kid. Not a kid anymore, really, but Ethan still thought of him that way. Who had developed a sensitivity to the climate of the garage that served him well in his work and occasionally made him perceptive about things outside of it. "There's a legal matter," Ethan said. "It'll resolve." "Okay," Cody said, and went back to work and didn't ask again. The call from Sandra that changed the temperature of everything came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the second meeting. Ethan was at the workbench looking at a fuel injector under a lighted magnifier when his phone rang. He answered it without putting down the injector. "They found something in their own internal records," Sandra said. "Something they apparently didn't realize they had." He set down the injector. "Tell me." Crossline's licensing division maintains a database of all active license agreements. Companies that have licensed the relay technology, terms, royalty rates, everything. Standard record keeping. As part of their internal review, someone went through the database and found correspondence that predates the licensing program. She paused, and in the pause, Ethan heard the quality of someone who has information they know is significant and are measuring how to deliver it. There were 2 conversations, email threads, internal, from early 2020, before the licensing program launched. The technology team was doing an implementation review, getting the relay ready for commercial licensing. And in those threads, multiple engineers referenced design elements they were working from, and one of those engineers, apparently while trying to track down documentation for a specific aspect of the protection protocol, found a reference to an earlier version of the filing that still had both names on it. Ethan said nothing. "He flagged it internally," Sandra continued. "Not loudly. He He sent a message to his team lead asking whether there was a co-inventor situation they needed to be aware of for the licensing documentation. The team lead forwarded it to legal. Legal sent back a one-line response. Inventorship is resolved per amended filing. Proceed with implementation. How many people saw that exchange? At minimum, 4. The engineer, the team lead, whoever in legal sent the response, and at least one other engineer who was CC'd on the original message. Sandra's voice was careful. Ethan, this is now a second internal flag. 2 separate occasions, one during acquisition, one during implementation, where someone inside Crossline raised a question about the inventorship and was told, in effect, to keep moving. The garage was quiet around him. Somewhere outside, a car was pulling into the small parking area in front of the bays, tires on gravel. Does Marcus know they found this? Ethan asked. He found it. His team turned it up during the document review. He disclosed it to us yesterday evening. A pause. I think he disclosed it because he didn't have a choice. If he'd held it back and we'd found it later through discovery, it would have been catastrophic. But there's something else. What? He disclosed it with a cover letter that I've read 4 times now. It's a careful letter, but reading between the lines, and I've been doing this long enough to read between lines, I think Marcus Webb is trying to limit his own exposure. The second flag happened after the acquisition, which means the legal response to it came from his department. He's putting distance between himself and that response. Ethan processed this. He's turning. I wouldn't go that far, but I think his primary loyalty right now is to his own professional standing, and his professional standing is best served by making sure the record shows he disclosed everything when he found it, which helps us. Which helps us considerably, yes, but that's what's petty. Out. Cody appeared in the garage doorway and mimed a steering wheel at Ethan, the customer's car. Ethan held up one finger. Cody disappeared back outside. What does this do to the negotiation? Ethan asked. It does a lot, Sandra said. The willful infringement argument just got significantly stronger. We're no longer looking at one internal flag during acquisition. We're looking at a pattern. A flag during acquisition that was buried, a flag during implementation that was dismissed, and a licensing program that launched and ran for 4 years after both of those flags. She let that sit for a moment. I'm going to request an emergency session. I think they'll agree to one. When? End of this week if I can get it scheduled. I'm going to call Diane Cho this afternoon. A pause. Ethan, I think we're close. I want to be measured about that because things can still go sideways, but I think the shape of this is becoming clear to everyone in the room. He hung up and stood at the workbench for a moment, his hand on the phone. The injector was still in the magnifier stand, its tiny spray ports visible under the light like something from a different scale of the world. He went outside to see about the customer's car. The emergency session was held on Friday. Same conference room on the 8th floor, same desert view, different atmosphere. The way the same room can feel completely different when the balance of what's known has shifted and everyone in it is aware of the shift. Damian Cross was there again. He looked more tired than the last time, and also, somehow, more settled, like a man who has accepted something and is now dealing with its practical consequences rather than still fighting the acceptance. He had brought a legal pad and a pen, and he used them, which was different from the last meeting where he'd mostly listened. Sandra opened by presenting the second internal flag, the implementation review email thread, with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. She didn't editorialize. She let the document sit on the table and speak for itself. The response from Crossline's side was notably different from the previous meetings. Marcus Webb's posture was different. He sat slightly back from the table rather than leaning in, and when Diane Cho spoke, which she did more than Marcus this time, she spoke in the language of resolution rather than resistance. The words "going forward" appeared frequently. The phrase "both parties' interests" appeared. These were the verbal markers of a negotiation that had moved from contested to constructive, and Sandra recognized them and responded to them with a precision that Ethan found quietly impressive to watch. The historical licensing figure was the last major item. Everything else, the inventorship correction, The royalty structure for future licensing, the form of the public acknowledgement, had been broadly agreed in principle in the days leading up to the session through back-channel conversations between Sandra and Diane that Ethan had been briefed on but not present for. The number was the thing. Crossline's position coming in was $8 million for the historical period. Their attorneys had constructed a careful argument for why the attributable revenue figure should be calculated on a narrower basis than Sandra's analysis suggested, essentially arguing that a significant portion of the licensing revenue was attributable to Crossline's own development work after the acquisition, not to the original architecture. Sandra's response to this was a single document, a side-by-side comparison of the original patent claims, the ones with Ethan's name on them, and the claims as they appeared in the current licensed version of the technology. The core architectural claims were essentially unchanged. The language had been refined. The specifications had been elaborated. But the fundamental logic structure, the routing architecture, the protection protocol, the layered fail-safe design, was the same thing Ethan had built in a rental apartment in Phoenix during a winter when his marriage was ending. The development value-add argument doesn't hold for the core claims, Sandra said, and her voice was pleasant and completely immovable. The claims that licensees are paying for, the claims that differentiate this technology in the market, are the original architectural claims. We can demonstrate that through the licensing agreements themselves, which specify what's being licensed and at what tier. Diane Cho looked at the comparison document. She looked at it for longer than she needed to if she were just reading it. She was, Ethan understood, making a calculation. "Mr. Cross," Diane said without looking up from the document, "the 8 is the floor we came in with. What's the ceiling you've authorized?" The question surprised everyone slightly. It was unusually direct for the format, cutting past the negotiation theater to ask the principal what his number actually was. Damian Cross looked at Diane for a moment, then looked at Ethan. "What's your floor?" he asked. Ethan looked at Sandra. She gave him the smallest nod. They had discussed this. 11, Ethan said. Damian wrote something on his legal pad. He looked at it. He put the pen down. 11.5, he said, and I want the royalty rate on future licensing fixed at a number that doesn't require renegotiation for the life of the patent. Sandra said, "What rate are you proposing?" 4.5% of net licensing revenue attributable to the core claims, adjusted annually for CPI, for the remaining life of the patent and any continuations. Sandra made a note. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, she said, 5%, same structure. The room was quiet for about 10 seconds. "Done," Damian Cross said. That. The paperwork took 3 more weeks. This was the part that nobody outside of legal work ever understood, that the hardest part of a negotiation was sometimes the 3 weeks after everyone agreed, when the specific language of every clause had to be hammered into a form that both sides' attorneys could sign off on without either side feeling they'd given up something they hadn't agreed to give up. Sandra spent those 3 weeks with her reading glasses on more or less continuously, and Ethan spent them in the garage and trying not to think too hard about the paperwork because thinking about it didn't speed it up and only made the waiting feel longer. The inventorship correction was being filed with the USPTO simultaneously with the settlement agreement. Diane Cho's office was handling the filing, and Sandra was reviewing every word of it. The filing would restore Ethan's name to the patent record as a co-inventor. Every future reference to the technology in Crossline's licensing materials, marketing documents, and technical publications would include acknowledgement of both inventors. The settlement required Crossline to issue a formal correction to any publication or press release that had previously attributed sole invention to Alan Rourke. Alan Rourke himself was a separate matter. His role in the fraudulent inventorship amendment was documented. The handle at email, the declaration he'd signed for the USPTO petition, the assignment documents. Crossline had included in the settlement a cooperation clause requiring them to share their documentation of Alan's conduct with Ethan's legal team, which opened the door to a separate action against Alan personally. Sandra had discussed this with Ethan carefully. "You could pursue him," she said. "Fraud on the patent office is serious. There's potential criminal exposure, and there's definitely civil exposure." "What would I get from it?" "Some money, Potentially. Satisfaction, possibly. A record that explicitly names what he did. Ethan thought about Alan in Denver, running another small technology consultancy. He thought about the phone call 4 years ago. I tried. And the particular quality of Alan's silence when Ethan had said, "You didn't." He thought about what it cost to carry a legal fight against someone who had nothing worth taking compared to what it cost to just let the record speak and move on. File the documentation with the USPTO as part of the inventorship correction record, he said. Let the record show what happened. I'm not going to chase him. Sandra looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. She didn't push it. On the day the settlement was signed, it happened without ceremony. There was no room full of people, no formal occasion. Sandra emailed Ethan a PDF of the executed agreement, all 47 pages of it, signed on the final page by Damian Cross personally rather than delegated to counsel, which Sandra noted as unusual and which Ethan thought he understood. Ethan signed his own copies, Sandra witnessed them, and she sent back the completed set. He was under a car when she called to confirm. It's done, she said. He rolled out from under the car. He was holding a socket wrench. The bay smelled of oil and metal and the particular dusty, warm smell of desert air coming through the open bay doors. Cody was at the workbench with his back turned, doing something with a parts catalog and a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. Okay, Ethan said. The USPTO filing goes in tomorrow morning. The inventorship correction will be in the public record within a few weeks, depending on processing. A pause. The first royalty payment will be issued at the end of next quarter. The historical settlement amount transfers in 30 days per the agreement. Okay, he said again. Ethan. Her voice had changed slightly, not quite warmth. She was not a warm person in the performative sense, but something genuine in it. This was a good result. Better than I expected when you first sat down across from me. You did good work, he said. We did good work. He sat on the edge of the car's open door sill for a moment, the socket wrench in his hand, and looked at the open bay door and the patch of desert afternoon visible through it. Pale sky, brown earth, the edge of the building across the way. Cody had turned around at some point and was looking at him. It's done? Cody asked. It's done. Cody nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something more significant than anything he was finding. Finally, you want me to get lunch? I was going to go to the diner. Yeah, Ethan said. Get me whatever they have today. Cody grabbed his keys and went, and Ethan sat in the quiet bay for a few minutes by himself. The industry press picked up the USPTO inventorship correction about 3 weeks after it was filed. It was a small item at first. A trade publication notice, the kind of thing that patent attorneys and licensing professionals read, and most other people don't. But the Vector X9 was a known quantity in automotive circles, and the smart relay technology had become significant enough in the EV and hybrid market that the correction of its inventorship record was the kind of thing that rippled outward from the specialist press into the broader automotive media. A journalist from an automotive technology publication called Mercer Auto on a Wednesday morning. Cody answered, said he wasn't sure Mr. Mercer was available, came to the back office where Ethan was doing invoices, and said there was a journalist on the phone. Ethan talked to the journalist for about 8 minutes. He confirmed the settlement existed. He confirmed his role in developing the original relay architecture. He declined to characterize Crossline's conduct in any terms beyond what was in the public record. When the journalist asked how he felt about the outcome, he thought about it for a moment. I feel like the record is accurate now, he said. That's what I wanted. That's it? That's it. The journalist wrote a piece that ran the following week. It was accurate, which Ethan appreciated. It described the technology, the inventorship dispute, and the settlement outcome. It quoted Ethan's 8 minutes worth of comments, used a photograph that Cody had taken on his phone of Ethan in the garage, standing at the workbench, in work clothes, completely ordinary looking, and it quoted a statement from Crossline Dynamic Systems acknowledging Ethan Mercer as co-inventor of the technology and expressing the company's commitment to accurate attribution in all future materials. Damian Cross's name appeared in the piece as the founder of Crossline. It did not appear in connection with personal wrongdoing. The journalist had been careful about that. which Ethan thought was fair. Two things happened in the weeks after the piece ran that Ethan hadn't anticipated. The first was a call from a law school, a professor who taught a seminar on patent ethics and wanted to discuss the case as a teaching example. Not Ethan specifically, just the structure of what had happened, how an inventorship fraud could persist through multiple layers of institutional review, and what the structural conditions were that allowed it to go undetected or unchallenged for years. Ethan spent 40 minutes on the phone with her and found the conversation unexpectedly interesting. She was a precise thinker who asked good questions and didn't fill silence unnecessarily, and he told her things he hadn't articulated to anyone during the legal process, about the specific mechanism by which being absent during a difficult period had created the conditions for the taking, about how the institutional tendency to treat a clean-looking document as sufficient evidence of clean conduct was the structural vulnerability that made the whole thing possible. He wasn't angry when he talked about these things. He was analytical. She appreciated that, he could tell. The second thing was a letter. It arrived at Mercer Auto in a business envelope with a Scottsdale return address that Ethan didn't recognize immediately, and then did. He opened it at the workbench on a slow Thursday morning. It was handwritten, not typed with a signature, actually handwritten in the specific slightly formal cursive of someone who learned to write with intention and doesn't do it often enough anymore to be fluid. Mr. Mercer, I owe you a letter that I probably should have written before the settlement was signed. I didn't, partly because of legal advice and partly because I wasn't sure what to say. I'm still not entirely sure, but I'm writing it anyway. I've been in this business for a long time. I've made a lot of decisions, and most of them I stand behind. This one I don't stand behind, not because I made it in bad faith, I believe I didn't, but because I didn't ask enough questions when I had the chance to, and the people around me made it easier not to ask, and I let that be enough. That's not a justification. I'm aware of what it is. What you built is real. I've had our technical team walk me through it in a way I should have done years ago. The architecture is genuinely elegant in a way that doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen by committee. It happened because someone understood the problem at a level that most people don't reach. I'm sorry it took a dead car and a flathead screwdriver to make me look at this correctly. The record is accurate now. I intend to make sure it stays that way. Damian Cross. Ethan read the letter twice. He set it down on the workbench. He picked up his coffee and drank some of it. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel, reading it. He'd expected something more definitive, catharsis, or the clean click of something finally closing. What he felt was more ordinary than that. It was the feeling of a thing that had been wrong for a long time becoming right, which sounds like it should feel larger than it does, but in practice tends to arrive with the quiet relief of a weight set down rather than a victory announced. He folded the letter and put it in the drawer of the workbench. Not the office, not a file, just the drawer, near the wrenches. He went back to work. That afternoon, a woman came in with a sedan that was making a sound she couldn't describe accurately, but could imitate. And her imitation was close enough that Ethan knew within about 30 seconds what the likely cause was. And he told her, and she looked relieved in the specific way people look when a problem that has been worrying them turns out to be a problem that can be fixed. He took the car in, confirmed the diagnosis, did the work, and she picked it up before closing time. She paid the invoice without any comment about the price in either direction. Ethan noted this internally as the mark of a transaction that had been fair. He locked up the bays at 6:15, walked the 2 streets to his rental house, made dinner from what was in the refrigerator, and sat on the back step in the evening air and looked at the cottonwood tree for a while. The tree was in the last of its fall color. Not dramatic color. This wasn't New England, but a warm yellow that caught the last of the day's light and held it for a few minutes before the sun finished dropping and everything went to the gray-blue of desert dusk. It was an ordinary kind of beautiful, the kind that doesn't ask you to stop and witness it, the kind that's just there. Somewhere in Scottsdale, in a climate-controlled garage the size of an aircraft hangar, a Vector X9 sat in its center bay with its relay logic corrected and its startup sequence unobstructed, capable of running without issue, the protection protocol doing exactly what it had been designed to do, reading conditions accurately, making sound decisions, allowing the machine to be what it was built to be. The way things work when the record is right, and the names are where they belong. The royalty payment arrived on a Thursday. Not with fanfare, not with a phone call from Sandra or a notification from anyone at Crossline. Just a deposit confirmation in Ethan's bank account that he saw on his phone screen while he was eating breakfast. Oatmeal, standing at the kitchen counter the way he always ate breakfast, not sitting down. A habit from years of mornings when sitting felt like a commitment to stillness he couldn't afford. He looked at the number. He set the phone face down on the counter. He finished the oatmeal. Then he picked the phone up again and looked at the number a second time, not because he'd forgotten it, but because seeing something once and seeing it twice are different experiences, and the second time is when it becomes real. It was not an obscene amount. The first quarterly royalty, calculated on the net licensing revenue from the previous quarter per the agreement, came to a figure that was meaningful without being transformative. Meaningful in the way that changes the particular quality of your worry rather than eliminating it entirely. The historical settlement amount had transferred 30 days after signing, as specified, and that number had been large enough that Ethan had spent an uncomfortable week deciding what to do with it. He'd paid off the mortgage balance on a small property he owned at the edge of town. Not the rental house he lived in, but a lot he'd bought years ago, thinking he might build something on it eventually. He'd put the remainder in an account that he mostly didn't look at, because looking at it made him feel strange in a way he couldn't entirely account for. He wasn't built for money in the way that some people are. He didn't know what to do with it when it exceeded what he needed, and what he needed was not much. He had the garage and the truck and the house and a life that fit him the way worn-in work clothes fit. Not elegant, but right in the specific way that things are right when they've been adjusted by long use to the shape of the person using them. The royalties, though, were different from the settlement. The settlement had been a correction, a payment for what had already happened, a retroactive writing of an account that had been kept wrong for years. It was significant, but it was backward-looking. The royalties were something else. They were ongoing. They arrived each quarter and would continue arriving for the remaining life of the patent and its continuations. And what they represented was not compensation for the past, but recognition in the present. The financial form of the public record saying, in its own quiet institutional language, that Ethan Mercer had built something that was still being used and still mattered, and the world was going to keep acknowledging that on a quarterly basis, whether anyone made a ceremony of it or not. He washed the oatmeal bowl. He walked to the garage. Done. Cody had started arriving before Ethan most mornings, which was a change from the early months of his employment and one that Ethan had noticed without commenting on. He was there when Ethan pulled up, both bays already open, the diagnostic computer running its startup sequence on the bench. He had the coffee going. He had also, at some point in the past few weeks, started organizing the parts inventory in a system that was slightly different from Ethan's original system, but was, Ethan had to admit, better in certain practical respects. He hadn't asked before implementing it. He'd just done it and waited to see if Ethan said anything. Ethan hadn't said anything. He'd adopted the new system. "There's a car coming in at 9, Cody said when Ethan walked in. "Mercedes S-Class, 2021. Guy drove it up from Tucson. He says the suspension feels wrong, but 3 shops told him everything checks out." "What kind of wrong?" He couldn't describe it well on the phone, said it's like the car knows something he doesn't. Ethan considered this. "That's actually a decent description. Run the active suspension module diagnostics when it comes in. There's a calibration drift issue in that generation that doesn't throw codes but shows up if you look at the sensor variance data over a drive cycle." Cody wrote something on the notepad he kept in his shirt pocket. "Is that documented somewhere?" "In my head," Ethan said. He poured a coffee. "I'll show you when the car gets here." This was, in many ways, how most of Ethan's knowledge lived. In his head, accumulated over years of working on things and paying attention to what he saw, cross-referenced against things he'd read and things he'd been told by people whose judgment he respected, and things he'd figured out through the specific process of elimination that happens when you've been wrong enough times to recognize what wrong looks like. He was not a credentialed man in the formal sense. He had no wall of certificates, no advanced degrees, no professional associations. What he had was 20-something years of uninterrupted attention to how machines worked and why they stopped working. And that was worth more than most people realized until they were standing in a garage with a car that nobody else could fix. He'd thought about this during the legal process, about what credentials mean and what they don't mean, about the gap between the official record of a person's competence and the actual competence of the person, about how institutions tend to trust documents over observation, and how that tendency creates the specific kind of blindness that had allowed 12 specialists and 2 factory engineers to miss a reset point that existed in an architecture they'd never been told about because the man who built the architecture had been written out of the record. He didn't think about it bitterly. He thought about it the way you think about how a system works when you've spent time inside it, with interest and without illusion. The professor from the law school called again in November, about 6 weeks after their first conversation. Her name was Dr. Miriam Achebe, and she had been using the case in her seminar, and she wanted to ask Ethan if he'd be willing to come and speak to her students. Not about the legal specifics, she clarified. Her students could read those from the public record, but about the experience, the texture of it, what it felt like to carry the knowledge of a wrong for 4 years, and how you decide when to act on it and what sustains you while you're waiting. Ethan said he'd think about it. He thought about it for about a week. He asked himself what he would actually say to a room full of law students, most of whom would go on to work at firms that looked a lot more like Crossline's legal department than like Sandra Voss's strip mall practice, and whether anything he could say would be useful to them or whether it would just be a story that made them feel something for an hour and then faded. He decided to go anyway. Not because he was sure it would be useful, but because Miriam Achebe had asked him questions that nobody else had asked. And there was something in those questions that made him feel the conversation deserved to be continued in whatever form it could take. He drove to Tucson on a Tuesday morning in January and sat in front of 22 law students in a room that smelled like new carpet and coffee from the machine in the corner, and he talked for about 40 minutes and then answered questions for another 30. He was not a natural public speaker. He did not have the ease of a person who has spent years performing their own story. He talked about the technology in more detail than Miriam had probably expected, because talking about how the relay worked was easier than talking about how it felt to watch it used without his name on it, and the students actually engaged with the technical part more than he'd expected. A couple of them asked specific questions about the patent claim structure that showed they'd done the reading. When one of them, a young woman in the second row with the focused intensity of someone who had not gotten to law school by being casually engaged with anything, asked him what he wished he'd done differently, he was quiet for a moment. "I wish I'd been harder to lose track of," he said. "When I stepped back from everything during the difficult period, that was the right thing for me personally. I needed to do that. But I did it in a way that made me easy to cut out. I didn't maintain the relationships that would have made me visible. I didn't keep documentation in a form that was easily accessible. I assumed that the record was self-protecting." He paused. "It's not. Records only protect you if you protect them." "Do you think the law should have protected you automatically?" she pressed. "Without you having to do any of that?" "The law should have," he said. "And in principle it did. The rules around joint ownership and transfer consent existed. They just weren't enforced because the violation was made to look like it hadn't happened." He thought for a moment. "There's a difference between a law that exists and a law that operates. For the second kind, you need a person who's paying attention. I wasn't paying attention. That's on me as much as it's on the system." The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms get quiet when something has landed that people need to process before responding to. Miriam Achebe, sitting to the side of the room with a legal pad on her knee, wrote something and underlined it. After the class, she walked him to the parking lot. It was a clear January day, cold for Tucson, the mountains visible to the north with a faint white line along their ridges that might have been early snow. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It was worth the drive," he said, which was true. He hadn't expected it to be as true as it was, but it was. "I'm going to write a paper," she said, "about the structural conditions that enabled this, the way multiple institutional checkpoints failed, the way information was managed to prevent accountability." She paused. "I'll send you a draft if you're willing to read it." "Send it," he said. "I'll read it." He drove back to Deering, and the mountains stayed visible in his rearview mirror for the first 30 miles before the road curved away from them. In February, a package arrived at Mercer Auto. It was from Vector's North American Technical Division, a company that had every reason to be uncomfortable with the events of the past year, given that their proprietary smart relay had been at the center of a legal dispute that had attracted industry press attention and resulted in a very public inventorship correction. Ethan had expected some communication from them eventually. He hadn't expected a package. Inside was a document, a formal technical bulletin printed on Vector letterhead, and a cover letter signed by Vector's head of engineering for the Western Hemisphere, a man whose name Ethan didn't recognize. The cover letter thanked Ethan for identifying the logic flaw in the relay's protection protocol and explained that Vector had, following his diagnosis, conducted a thorough review of the protection architecture across all production units and had developed a firmware update that corrected the triggering condition that caused the lockout. The update had been pushed to all affected vehicles. The technical bulletin enclosed described the nature of the flaw and its resolution, and credited in a formal technical document that would exist in Vector's engineering record permanently, Ethan Mercer, with identifying the issue. There was a handwritten note from the head of engineering on a separate card. It said, "The Franz you may remember from the garage said to send his regards. He's been telling the story of your diagnosis since October. In some circles, it's become something of a legend." Ethan read the note twice. He thought about Franz, the young Vector engineer who had said something in German under his breath that translated to, "This is not possible," and felt something that was almost amusement, and not quite, the way you feel when something absurd and something true occupy the same moment. He put the card on the workbench. He read the technical bulletin carefully, checking the corrected logic specification against his own understanding of how the architecture worked. The fix was right. They'd identified the precise sequence of normal range conditions that combined into a false fault state, and they'd adjusted the weighting in the detection algorithm to require a more significant deviation before triggering lockout. Clean solution. The kind of thing that looks obvious once someone's shown you where to look. He filed the bulletin in the reference binders on the side shelf, in the section for European high-performance vehicles behind the tab that said Vector. He added a handwritten note to the tab. Smart Relay Logic Correction. See Bulletin, February. Then he went back to work. Spring came to Deering the way spring came to that part of Arizona, not dramatically, not with the theatrical bloom of wetter climates, but as a gradual warming and a change in the quality of the light, and the desert going from its winter gray-green to something warmer. The Palo Verde trees coming out in yellow that lasted about 2 weeks before fading into the dust-colored green of summer. Ethan liked this season. He liked the mornings especially, when the air was cool enough to leave the bay doors open without the heat becoming oppressive by mid-morning, and the light came in at an angle that lit up the work well. He was in the middle of a clutch replacement on a 10-year-old truck when his phone rang and the screen said Sandra Voss. "Second quarter royalties," she said when he answered. "Slightly higher than first quarter. Licensing revenue was up." "Okay," he said. "Just wanted you to know." "I appreciate it." A pause. "You don't need me to call you with these, do you? You just check the account." "I'd check the account," he agreed, "but I don't mind you calling." He could hear her smile in the brief silence. "How's the garage?" "Good. Cody's getting better. He started catching things before I point them out." "That's a good sign." "It is." He set down the tool he was holding. "Sandra, I've been meaning to ask you something." "Ask?" "The Cresswell attorney, the one who flagged the inventorship issue during the acquisition and was told to proceed. Do you know what happened to him?" A pause. "He's at a smaller firm now, does transactional work mostly. Why?" "I've thought about him a few times. He saw something and said something and was told it wasn't his problem." "That's the job sometimes," Sandra said, not dismissively, just accurately. "I know. I just think about the people who saw the thing and said something and got told to keep moving. There's a cost to that." "There is," Sandra agreed. "There's also the fact that he disclosed it internally. It was in the record. When the time came, it was findable." Ethan thought about that. "That's true. Sometimes the most a person can do is make sure the thing is in the record," she said, "so that when someone comes looking, it's there." He sat with that for a moment. It was a good thought. It was the kind of thought that applied to more than the situation they were discussing, and he suspected she knew that too. "Thanks, Sandra," he said. "Take care of yourself," she said, and hung up. He put the phone away and picked up the tool and went back to the clutch. Jeffrey Pratt called in April. It had been 6 months since the settlement, and Jeffrey called the way he always called. Without preamble, the social register of a man who operated at a level of professional busyness that made niceties feel like attacks. "I have a client," Jeffrey said. "Okay," Ethan said. "McLaren. Current generation. The active aerodynamic system is behaving erratically. The rear wing is deploying at the wrong speeds. 3 McLaren-certified shops have looked at it and can't find the cause." "What region?" "Phoenix. The client can bring it to you." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the schedule for the week, the F-150 he was mid-job on, the Subaru coming in Wednesday, the routine service appointments that Cody could handle independently now, without supervision. He did the math. "Friday," he said. "Tell them to bring it Friday morning, and I need full diagnostic output from all 3 previous shops before they arrive." "I'll get it." "And Jeffrey?" "Yeah." "Same rate as last time." A pause. And in the pause was the memory of the last time, so the Vector, the garage, the flathead screwdriver, all the things that had come after. "Same rate," Jeffrey said. "Of course." He hung up. Ethan put the phone in his pocket. Cody appeared from the other bay, wiping his hands. "Another one?" Cody asked. "McLaren. Friday." Cody nodded. He had stopped being impressed by the names of the cars a while ago, which was the right development. The name of a car was irrelevant to the problem the car had, and the problem was what mattered. "I'll clear the second bay," Cody said, and went to do it. The McLaren came on Friday, and the problem turned out to be a software conflict between the aerodynamics management module and a driver assistance update that had been pushed remotely by the manufacturer 6 weeks earlier. The update had introduced a parameter change in the vehicle speed calculation that the aerodynamics module was reading correctly, but interpreting according to its pre-update logic, resulting in deployment thresholds that were off by a calibrated margin that was small enough to pass basic testing but large enough to be felt by a driver who knew the car. It took Ethan about 2 hours to identify it and another 40 minutes to implement the workaround, which involved rolling back a specific parameter in the aerodynamics module to align with the post-update speed calculation while flagging the conflict for McLaren's engineering team to address in their next release. The car's owner was a man in his 60s who had the impatient energy of someone accustomed to problems being solved faster than problems can actually be solved. He paced outside the bay for the first hour. By the second hour, he'd stopped pacing and was standing near the bay door watching Ethan work, not saying anything, just watching. By the time Ethan straightened up from the diagnostic terminal and told him what he'd found and what he'd done, the man was quiet in a different way. The quietness of someone who has been watching competence operate and has recognized it. 3 shops, the man said. "It's a recent update," Ethan said. "The conflict is specific and the documentation from the manufacturer doesn't mention it yet. It'll probably show up as a known issue in the next release notes." "But you found it." "I found it." The man looked at him for a moment. He had the look of someone formulating a question he wasn't sure how to ask. "You're the person who fixed the Vector," he said. "The cross car." "Yes." "And the relay thing." The man gestured vaguely, indicating the whole landscape of the past 6 months that he'd presumably read about in some form. "Yes," Ethan said. The man nodded slowly. He seemed to be processing something, and what he arrived at wasn't what Ethan expected. "My father was an engineer," he said. "Aerospace. He designed a component that went into a navigation system that's still being used in some capacity today. He never got rich from it. He spent his career at the same company, at the same level, doing work that nobody outside the field ever heard of." He paused. "He would have liked to have met you, I think." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. The comment had arrived from an unexpected direction, and he was giving it the respect of actual consideration rather than a reflexive response. "What was the component?" he asked. The man almost smiled. "A relay, actually. Different kind, but a relay." He paid the invoice without discussion and drove the McLaren out of the bay and down the gravel drive and onto the road, and the active aerodynamic system held exactly where it should hold and deployed exactly when it should deploy, and the car disappeared around the bend at the end of the street, running the way it had been built to run. There is a version of this story that ends with something large. A ceremony, maybe. A room full of people, and a plaque, and the kind of public acknowledgement that makes the news cycle, and gives the narrative the satisfying visual of a man receiving, in front of witnesses, what was always his. Or a version where the settlement produces a transformation of fortune so complete that the before and after are separated by a bright line, where everything that came before the flathead screwdriver and the vector's relay housing is clearly the hard part, and everything after is the vindicated part, clean and resolved. That's not this story. What happened was quieter and more gradual and more honest than that, and in being those things it was more real. Ethan Mercer's name went into the record. It went in through the USPTO filing, through the licensing documentation, through the Vector Technical Bulletin, through Miriam Achebe's paper, which was published in a journal that about 300 people in the world read seriously. It went in through a trade press article that circulated in the automotive technology world and was passed around by the kind of people who care about those things. It went in through the story that Franz in Stuttgart apparently told anyone who would listen. The story of a man who walked into a garage with a worn leather bag and fixed something in 90 seconds that a room full of experts had spent 6 days failing to fix. The name went in. Not with fanfare, not with the weight of vindication that the movies would give it. Just into the record, quietly, accurately, in the place where it always should have been. That's what Ethan had wanted. Not fame, not the destruction of anyone who'd wronged him, not a version of himself that the world would recognize on the street. Just the record being right. Just the architecture he'd built carrying his name the way a building carries its architect's name. Not loudly, not as a story, just as a fact in the record that anyone who looked closely enough could find. What he understood, in the months after everything resolved, was something that he'd suspected for years, but couldn't quite articulate until he was on the other side of it. The truth about a thing doesn't require anyone's permission to be true. It just sits there, patient and indifferent to how long it takes to be acknowledged, the way an undocumented reset point sits on a relay housing, waiting for the one person who knows it's there to find it. You can remove a name from a filing. You can manage a briefing document so that the concerning part reads as the resolved part. You can build an enterprise on the foundation of something you didn't build and spend years assuming the foundation is yours because you're the one standing on it. But the architecture knows who made it, and eventually, not always, not in every story, but in enough of them, someone comes along who needs to understand why the machine stopped working, and the answer leads back to the beginning, to the original hands, to the person who built the thing and understood it at the level where the truth lives. Barshem. On a morning in late spring, Ethan arrived at the garage to find a car he didn't recognize parked in the lot. Not a customer car. Too early for most customers, and the car was parked off to the side rather than in front of the bays. It was a modest sedan, gray, and leaning against it with a coffee cup was a man in his late 40s who looked at Ethan with an expression that was difficult to read. Ethan recognized him after a moment. It took longer than it should have because the years had changed them both, and because Ethan had not allowed himself to picture the face very often. But he recognized him. Alan Rourke. They looked at each other across the parking lot for a moment. The morning was cool and still, and the sun was low enough that the light was doing the long shadow thing it did in the early hours, stretching everything out across the gravel. Ethan walked over. He didn't hurry. He stopped about 6 feet from Alan and stood there. Alan looked worse than Ethan remembered him. Older in ways that weren't just the neutral passage of time, the kind of older that comes from carrying something. He was thinner. His face had a quality of having been through something specific that he hadn't come out of entirely clean. "I heard you were going to come after me," Alan said. His voice was careful. Not quite afraid, but in the neighborhood of afraid. "I heard that's what you heard," Ethan said. It wasn't true. Alan absorbed this. "You had grounds." "I know. So why?" "Because I wasn't interested in what it would cost me to do it," Ethan said. "And because what I actually wanted wasn't something I needed you to give me." He looked at Alan for a moment. "The record is corrected. That was the thing." Alan was quiet. He turned his coffee cup around in his hands, a nervous habit that Ethan remembered from years ago, the same gesture, the same hands, older now. I told myself you'd disappeared, Alan said. I need you to understand that's what I told myself, that you were gone and not coming back, and the thing was going to die if I didn't move it forward. I know what you told yourself. It doesn't make it right. No, Ethan said. It doesn't. The morning was doing what Arizona mornings did, warming incrementally, the light changing from that early horizontal gold to something whiter and more direct. A bird was doing something in the Palo Verde at the edge of the lot, a small, persistent sound, repeated with the patience of a creature that has one job and does it without drama. What do you want? Ethan asked. From coming here? Alan thought about that honestly, which Ethan could tell because Alan's face when he was thinking honestly looked a specific way, slightly younger somehow, the performance of confidence that he usually wore loosening slightly. I don't know, he said. I think I wanted to see if you were going to look at me the way I've been expecting someone to look at me for 4 years. What way is that? Like I'm the kind of person who does things like that. Ethan looked at him, steadily, without performance, the same way he looked at a machine he was trying to understand. Not with judgment, just with the clear-eyed attention of someone who needed to see what was actually in front of them. You're the kind of person who did that, Ethan said. That's a fact. Whether that's the only kind of person you are is something I don't have an opinion about. Alan looked at him for a long moment. Something in his posture shifted. Not collapse, not relief exactly, just a release of something he'd been holding in a specific configuration. I'm sorry, he said. It came out plainly, without build-up, the way things come out when they've been held too long and finally find the air. Okay, Ethan said. Not I forgive you. Not it's fine. Just, okay. Received, heard, set down. They stood there for another few seconds, 2 men in a gravel parking lot in a small Arizona town in the early morning, with nothing more between them that needed to be said right now. Is there anything? Alan started. No, Ethan said. There's nothing you need to do. The record is what it is. Live with the version of yourself that did the thing and figure out what to do with it. He paused. That's what I had to do with my part in it. Alan nodded. He set his coffee cup on the roof of his car and straightened up. You built something real, he said. I always knew that. I want you to know I always knew that. I know, Ethan said. Alan got in his car. He backed out of the lot carefully and drove away down the empty morning street, and Ethan watched the car until it reached the end of the block and turned and was gone. He stood in the lot for a moment. Then he went inside and opened the bays and turned on the diagnostic computer and started the coffee and did all the things he did at the beginning of every working day. Cody arrived at 7:15 and went directly to the car he'd left half-finished the previous afternoon without saying anything except morning, which was enough. A truck came in at 8 with a check engine light that turned out to be an oxygen sensor. Routine, done in an hour. The customer was a woman who drove the truck for her landscaping business and needed it back by noon and got it back by 10:30, and she said thank you in the brisk, genuine way of someone who had already moved on to the next thing on her list before she finished the sentence. At noon, Ethan ate a sandwich at the workbench. He looked at the reference binders on the shelf. He looked at the tools on the pegboard. He looked at the way the light fell through the open bay doors onto the clean concrete floor, the familiar geometry of a space that had become, over years, an extension of how he thought. He thought about the relay architecture sitting inside cars all over the world right now, in drivetrains carrying people through their ordinary days, in vehicles doing the work of transport and movement and connection that vehicles do, the protection protocol reading conditions and making decisions, and allowing the machine to function according to the logic he'd built in a rental apartment during the worst winter of his life. He thought about his name in the record now, quiet and permanent, the way anything true is permanent when it finally finds its way into the place where it belongs. He thought about what it costs to build something real. Not in money, though it costs that too, but in the other currencies. The attention given over years, the capacity for doubt that has to be held alongside the capacity for certainty, the willingness to start again when the thing doesn't work, and to look honestly at why it doesn't work, and to fix it. Not because fixing it will be recognized, but because the thing should work, and you're the one who knows how to make it work. He thought about his father, briefly. A man who had fixed engines in a town smaller than Deering, who had died when Ethan was 23 without ever knowing anything about relay architecture or patent law or the specific kind of injury that happens when something you built gets transferred to someone else's name. A man whose hands Ethan had inherited along with certain other things that were harder to name. What his father had taught him, not through instruction, but through the accumulated example of years of watching, was that the quality of your work is the record that matters most. Not the official record, that could be altered, as Ethan now knew with more specificity than he'd ever wanted, but the functional record, the one that lives in the thing itself. A machine that works the way it was designed to work is its own testament to the person who designed it. You can remove the name. You cannot remove the understanding that the design required. The relay had kept working. Even when his name was off it, even when the world didn't know who had built the architecture inside it. The logic held because the logic was sound, and the soundness was his, and no document could change that. And eventually the document had to catch up to the fact. That was the thing he hadn't known how to say in Miriam Achebe's classroom, or in the parking lot with Alan, or in the conference room across from Damien Cross, the thing underneath all of it. Real work persists. It persists through the absence of recognition, through the bureaucratic management of records, through years of ordinary mornings and invoice stacks, and a truck with a wheel bearing that needs replacing, and a kid who's getting better at finding things before you have to point them out. The work is its own argument, and it makes that argument every time the machine runs, every time the protection protocol functions as it was designed, every time someone presses a start button and the car comes to life. It was enough. Not perfect. It was never going to be the clean, symmetrical justice that the story deserved in its ideal version. Alan was in Denver doing whatever Alan was doing. Marcus Webb was wherever he was. Cresswell was at a smaller firm. The world was exactly as complicated as it had always been, full of institutions that failed at the points where they were most needed, and people who made choices that served themselves when the cost could be distributed to someone who wasn't looking. But the record was right, and the relay worked. And Ethan Mercer's name was where it belonged, in the documentation of a thing that mattered, carrying the weight of what he'd actually done. He finished the sandwich. He washed his hands at the utility sink in the back. He went back to work.